This is every single Fallout vault explained in detail for over 4 hours. So sit back, relax, grab some popcorn, and enjoy. Almost every vault in Fallout ended in absolute disaster. And this was fully intentional because Vault-Tec didn't build shelters. They built laboratories. And the lab rats were all of the poor dwellers. So today, I'm covering what actually happened to these vaults. Not just what the experiments were, but how they actually ended. And I'm warning you right now, some of these endings are so dark, they make the actual experiments look tame by comparison. Vault 13, Death of a Vault Dweller. Let's start with the very first vault shown in the series. Vault 13 was initially presented as a control vault, a vault without an experiment. But here's the question. If Vault 13 was supposed to be normal, no weird social experiment, no cartoon villain overseer, then why did it still end up producing exile, rebellion, and eventually a full-scale Enclave abduction? Was Vault 13 ever truly a control group? Or was normal just another kind of trap? Yeah, I'm gonna go with a trap. Vault 13, located somewhere in California, often speculated to be near Mount Whitney, was presented as one of the safest bets in the Vault-Tec lineup. Nothing flashy, no obvious gimmick, just a sealed community built to outlast the bombs. That illusion held until 2161 when the Vault's water chip failed. You know, the one component keeping everyone from dying of thirst just stops working. Great engineering, Vault-Tec. Really top-notch quality control there. The Overseer draws straws and sends out one resident, later remembered as the Vault Dweller, on December 5th, 2161, to find a replacement. Inside the vault, most residents keep going as if routine will save them. Spoiler alert, it won't. But a rebel faction forms, convinced the Overseer is hiding the truth about the surface and eager to see the world for themselves. The Vault Dweller returns 5 months later with the chip, saving everyone, and the Overseer says, "You're a hero, and you have to leave." I'm sorry, what? You save the entire vault and get exiled? That's like rescuing someone from drowning and they respond by pushing you back in the water. Thanks for the water chip. Now, get out before you give people ideas about freedom. That exile doesn't just remove a person, it fractures the vault's identity. The rebels finally act, leaving Vault 13 to follow the unknown future that the Vault Dweller proved was possible. The Overseer is overthrown, possibly killed. The record becomes conveniently fuzzy there. And in a move that's both logical and darkly ironic, the remaining residents replace human leadership with a control computer purchased from the Brotherhood of Steel, trading one Overseer for a machine that can't be bribed, guilted, or appealed to. I mean, at least the computer won't exile you for being too competent. Probably. For decades, it worked. That is until 2241, when the Enclave arrives with a coded all-clear signal claiming the surface is safe and it's time to emerge. The vault opens. A family of 3 unseals the door, only to meet an Enclave vertebrate assault team. They're immediately gunned down, later labeled as resisting capture. The kind of excuse that only sounds believable if you've never met the Enclave, which, to be fair, they hadn't. But still, the rest of Vault 13 is kidnapped and flown to the Enclave oil rig for use in a world-ending aerosol plan. Yeah, that plan worked out really well for them, but we'll get to that in another video. And as a final insult, Vault 13 becomes a dumping ground for supposedly failed intelligent Deathclaw experiments. Except the Deathclaws aren't dumb at all. They're merely pretending. They turn the vault into their own community, with only the inconvenient fact that claws aren't great for pressing small buttons. From there, Vault 13's ending splits into possibilities. Extermination, capture, or survival through a voice module that lets Deathclaws interact with the vault systems. The good ending is famously bugged in-game, but fans point to later intelligent Deathclaw traces as evidence that it might still be the intended canon. So, what was the point of bringing up Vault 13 first? Well, it matters, because it exposes a brutal truth. Even when a vault looks normal, it's still vulnerable to engineered dependence, internal fracture, and external manipulation. The failure of the water chip shows how a single logistical weakness can control an entire society. The exile shows that even salvation can be punished if it threatens authority. And the Enclave's infiltration of Vault 13 ultimately proves the vault wasn't just a shelter, it was a resource waiting to be claimed. And that raises the question this video hopes to answer. If this is what happens to one of the most standard vaults ever built, then what did Vault-Tec do to the vaults that weren't meant to be normal at all? Let's move to the next vault where the experiment isn't a hidden twist. That's the entire point. Vault 8, literally 1984. Do you think the world today is dystopian enough? Cool, because Vault City is what happens when civilization not only survives the apocalypse, but then immediately decides the real enemy is everyone else. The scary part isn't that Vault City is evil, it's that Vault City thinks it's ethical. Let that sink in for a moment. Vault City, formerly Vault 8, presents itself as a pristine model society. Clean streets, bright lights, neat and tidy uniforms, and a proper government unlike most of the wasteland. But that shine comes with a price tag. Massive walls, heavy turrets, and a rigid social order that separates citizens from everyone deemed too poor, too dirty, or too wasteland to belong. If you don't meet their standards, you don't get welcomed. Quite the opposite, actually. You get managed, kept outside the gates, and treated like a necessary inconvenience. And the rules don't stop at the front door. Vault City leans hard into controlled living, strict civic expectations, tightly monitored behavior, and leadership that speaks to people like they're components in a machine, to the point that their welcome booth has a citizen who relies on nothing but a pamphlet to even communicate with you. I mean, imagine being so bureaucratic you can't even greet visitors without a script. That's not efficiency. That's a cry for help. Even the little details are telling. When a place starts obsessing over who's fit, pure, and acceptable, you're not looking at a community anymore. You're looking at a filter. But a filter for what? Here's the twist. If you didn't already see it coming, Vault City wasn't even one of the crazy experiment vaults. So why does it feel like one anyway? By 2241, Vault City's biggest crisis wasn't starvation or raiders. It's that the outside world refused to disappear. Their neighbor, the ghoul town of Gecko, created both a problem and a solution. Gecko's reactor helps keep Vault City powered, but it also creates tensions over contamination and undesirables. That dependency makes Vault City furious because it proves a humiliating truth. Their perfect society still needs help from people they look down on. So they do what they always do. Try to outsource their morals. You'll see officials who want compromise, but you'll also see voices in power pushing for harsher options, including using mercenaries to solve problems permanently. Vault City doesn't just fear the wasteland, it wants the wasteland to stay weak so Vault City can stay superior. This is why Vault City is so important. Even without a flashy Vault Tech gimmick, it becomes a very intentional prototype for what the Enclave mindset looks like in practice. Order through exclusion, safety through segregation, and progress that only applies to the chosen few. Vault City isn't a cautionary tale about chaos without order. It's a warning about stability without empathy. And honestly, that's scarier than most Vault experiments. Vault 77, Puppet or Puppeteer. Vault Tech didn't just love hostile environments, they especially loved impossible ones. Thus, Vault 77 decides to ask one of the nastiest questions of all. If you lock one person away with nothing but silence, how long before they invent a second voice and start not only believing, but doing what it tells them? Yeah, that's gonna be a fun time. Picture this. The Great War hits, the door seals, and it's just one man in a vault. No family, no neighbors, no routine, just the hum of machinery and a cardboard box. The moment he understands he's truly alone, he collapses. Days of pounding on the vault door, begging for an answer that never comes. After days and weeks without an answer, he opens the box. Inside there's hand puppets, a Vault Boy mascot, a grandmother, a king, and a dog. It's almost funny until you realize the joke is an experiment. Isolation isn't the background, it's the weapon. This is Vault Tech stripping away every stabilizer humans rely on. Community, accountability, critical thinking, just to see what replaces it. And at first, what replaces it looks harmless, like nothing more than simple make-believe. Kind of like what video games are to people. Distractions or coping mechanisms from the real world, hustle and bustle. When you have no one, your brain doesn't stay quiet. It improvises. So the man does what a lonely mind always does. He tells stories, he assigns roles, he makes the puppets talk because someone has to talk. The grandmother bakes pies. The king makes grand declarations. The dog barks on cue. It's childish, sure, but it's also survival. He's building companionship out of scraps, stitching a social world together with nothing but fabric and desperation. This is the key tragedy of Vault 77. It starts as coping, but coping can rot into dependency when there's nothing real left to anchor you. And then, one puppet stops following the script. But the Vault Boy was different. The Vault Boy spoke to the man. It said things that he didn't make it say. Not comforting things, not helpful things, devious things, cruel things. One night, the king had been murdered, with the Vault Boy initially taking responsibility, but later revealing it was the man who had murdered the king. That's the core horror of Vault 77. Whether it's possession or projection, the result is the same. The line between actor and audience collapses. The man no longer knows where he ends and the puppet begins. That's not a metaphor. That's actual dissociative identity disorder with a fabric accomplice. Leaving the vault doesn't cure the damage. It simply takes it outside. He finally tries to leave, only to find a warehouse-sized rad scorpion waiting outside, like the wasteland itself is guarding the punchline to a long, stale joke. After that, he moves through the world in fragments. A ghoul from a worse vault, a giant ant he rides, and raiders he kills at the puppet's urging. At that point, the puppet isn't entertainment anymore. It's permission, something he can wear on his hand and call the reason. People don't fear him because he's any kind of tactical genius. They fear him because he's proof that a human mind can become a weapon when it's hollowed out the right way, even with something as friendly and non-threatening as a hand puppet. And the Wasteland does what it always does with cowardice and superstition. It turns it into a legend. Years later, he holed up in a house demanding tribute from anyone who entered, not so much to enrich himself, but more to keep the puppet happy. And even by 2277, 200 years after Vault 77 was sealed, the sight of a Vault 77 jumpsuit was enough to make hardened raiders and slavers panic. That's the final cruelty. Vault-Tec didn't just run an experiment. They manufactured a roaming consequence, an urban legend built from isolation, paranoia, and a puppet that may have never spoken at all. And if Vault 77 shows what happens when one mind collapses in isolation, the next Vault proves what happens when an entire community is manipulated into destroying itself. Vault 11, the death penalty. Vault deep in the Mojave sits Vault 11, and unlike most vaults, it's completely empty. When its residents first entered, the door sealed shut behind them and couldn't be opened, and the vault computer told them of the vault's special rule each year. One person must enter a special execution chamber. If they didn't do that, the vault's life support systems would shut down, killing everyone. Only the original overseer knew this before the door sealed, and when the others found out he'd kept it secret, they democratically decided that the overseer should be the first sacrifice. Thus began the proud Vault 11 tradition of electing an overseer every year and sending them to die when their term ended. Yeah, democracy at its finest. Soon, elections became a twisted parody of American politics. Posters littered the halls. Don't vote for Glover. His family needs him. Rumors about Haley are baseless. Vote Stone for overseer. And just like real life, several political parties formed large voting blocks that would pull their votes together to control who lived and who died. Over time, these blocks grew more powerful and corrupt. The leader of one of these blocks eventually forced a woman named Catherine Stone to cheat on her husband with him, or her husband would be nominated for overseer, guaranteeing his death. She did what he said, and then the block leader nominated her husband anyway. Catherine responded with what people who study politics commonly call Plan B, mass murder. She went full Rambo, hunting down every Justice Block member she could find. In any other vault, she'd have been executed. In Vault 11, however, that would be a waste. In fact, this made her the perfect candidate for overseer. However, this was exactly what she wanted for 3 reasons. 1, she got revenge on the voting bloc that betrayed her. 2, her being nominated meant her husband wasn't, saving him. And 3, as overseer, she had the authority to alter the vault computer programming, changing the yearly selection of overseer from an election to be chosen completely and totally randomly. This, to put it lightly, was not received well. And by that I mean a full-blown civil war erupted as the vault lost its mind, with voting blocks going into an all-out revolt. When the fighting finally ended, there were only 5 survivors. Those last 5, broken and done with it all, decided to end the cycle. They marched into the sacrifice chamber together, telling the Vault AI that they are done. No longer will they send one to die, but they will die as one. And then a pre-recorded message congratulated them. The Vault AI was never going to shut off the life support. They had passed the vault test. The vault door unlocked and they were all free to go. So all that death and chaos and betrayal was for absolutely nothing. Of the 5, 4 immediately shot themselves. The 5th walked out into the Mojave, never to be seen again. If Vault 11 shows the danger of human nature, the next vault shows what happens when you remove the human part entirely. Vault 87, the super mutant hotspot. Vault 87 is arguably the closest we get to a genuine horror movie in Fallout, or at least one that won't get them sued by Naughty Dog. Whatever its original experiment was supposed to be was scrapped in 2076 when the US government decided to repurpose it as a secondary testing site for the forced evolutionary virus. It made sense since West Tech's main facility in California was probably gonna get nuked. So setting up a backup lab in a bomb-proof vault was good planning. Good for the scientists, anyway, not for the residents. So when the bombs fell, the dwellers crowded into a death trap. And I mean this literally. Within the first decade or so, over 90 deaths were reported, an insane number for any vault. In most cases, the bodies were quickly disposed of, except they weren't. 90% of those deaths were fake. The so-called deceased were abducted and taken to the restricted experimental wing for FEV experiments. The virus had been modified to emphasize certain beneficial traits: strength, endurance, resistance. It created super mutants. Most subjects gained muscle mass, lost all their hair, and lost most of their brain function. At least one forgot how to breathe and simply died. Yeah, the FEV was that stable. And again, I need to emphasize that transforming from FEV exposure is the most excruciating thing a human being can go through. Imagine pulling a muscle, except it's every single muscle on your body, along with every bone violently pushing and growing and morphing. And of course, it could just not work. and you end up dying as your body grows 8 spleens, but destroys your lungs because FEV isn't stable. But of course, the scientists kept going because progress was progress. And of course, with so many people disappearing, much of the rest of the vault was in mourning. One technician started hearing children's voices echoing through the walls and was told he was going insane. He wasn't. He was hearing the kids from Little Lamplight, a nearby cave where children had taken refuge after the war. But that's another whole thing we might get into in another video. Another man who was told his wife had died decided 5 stages of grief was too much and stopped in rage. He was convinced the scientists had killed her and plotted to murder them. We don't know exactly what happened, but we can make an educated guess. The grieving husband broke into the restricted labs to attack the scientists, and the test subjects escaped in the process. Mentally broken super mutants rampaged through the vault, killing or converting everyone they found. When they ran out of people to eat or turn into more of their own, they left the vault to plague the Capital Wasteland's people, killing and eating the weak, while bringing the strong back to make into more super mutants. But there's one more tragedy in this, one more twist, that makes this whole thing read like a Stephen King book. The man's wife wasn't a test subject. She just died of cancer, one of the very few natural deaths in the vault. The doctors just failed to properly console a grieving man, and he went off the deep end. So Vault 87 and the entire Capital Wasteland by extension didn't collapse because of the horrible, inhumane experiments. It collapsed because of one man's misunderstanding and the failure of doctors to realize how badly he was grieving. And speaking of turning people into something inhuman, let's jump to Vault 112. Vault 112, the virtual hell. In the Capital Wasteland, under a pretty unremarkable garage infested with mole rats, lies Vault 112. It's one of the smallest vaults in the series, but it's not the size that matters, but how much it traumatizes people. On paper, Vault 112 sounded like paradise. Every resident would live inside a virtual reality utopia. Each person was sealed in a stasis pod and uploaded into a simulation where every desire was fulfilled. In any other context, yeah, that would be dystopian. But when the world ends and you're stuck in a glorified basement, screw it, plug me in. To make things even better, the vault's overseer was Dr. Stanislaus Braun himself, a brilliant German scientist that had moved to the US and was responsible for multiple pre-war breakthroughs, including the Garden of Eden creation kit. There wasn't anyone alive that had better knowledge of that kind of tech than him, especially after the bombs fell. If anyone could keep the simulation running, it was him. Unfortunately, Braun is the problem, because Vault 112 was his reward from Vault-Tec and the US military for years of service. A personal kingdom where he could play God with the dwellers as his toys. Imagine Sword Art Online and Braun was the admin. The simulation was his playground and he got bored quickly. So he started torturing the other people for fun. Sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally. But hey, the good news was they didn't remember it because he kept wiping their memories. The residents would suffer, then forget, and Braun would start again. An infinite loop of cheerful ignorance, sudden extreme trauma, and back to life as usual over and over and over again. And ignorance is bliss. Because one resident, Old Lady Dithers, wasn't properly plugged into the simulation. So she was aware she was in one and remembered the horrible stuff Braun did. I don't know what's worse, knowing that she's in a simulation or that no one else believes her. And if you're wondering why you find them all still alive in Fallout 3, 200 years later, it's because their pods keep them in biological stasis. If they step out, they would probably die instantly, either rapidly aging or infection. But so long as they stay inside, they get to live and be tortured forever. Yay. In-game, when you go into the simulation, you get 2 options. Play along with Braun's twisted games until he's satisfied and lets you go. Or hack the system and kill everyone but Braun, freeing the vault dwellers from purgatory while trapping Braun in a new one since he's stuck in his simulation alone forever. So yeah, virtual torture for 200 years is bad. But you want to know what's worse? Becoming fertilizer for a plant that turns you into a puppet, a hungry puppet. Vault 22, the Green Hell. In every other vault, you eat plants. In Vault 22, the plants eat you. Vault 22 is easily one of Fallout's most infamous vaults, and does deserve a spot on this list. I don't know, it just feels like everyone who has made a video on vaults or New Vegas has talked about it, and I'd be torn apart in the comments section if I didn't cover it here. So here we go. The vault was staffed by pre-war scientists trying to solve global hunger by genetically modifying crops. It's a noble idea, since even ignoring the rest of the world who are undoubtedly doing worse. By the 2070s in the USA, international trade had collapsed. The US population had ballooned past 400 million, and shortage riots were becoming more and more common. Feeding America was becoming a problem. Vault 22 was supposed to be the solution to that problem, and it was promising. The government and a few private partners donated plenty of money and biosamples, including a new fungal strain from the geniuses over at Big Mountain Research Facility. That fungus, Beauveria mordicana, was basically Fallout's version of cordyceps. from The Last of Us. It infected its host, killed it, then puppeted the corpse to spread spores to new victims. Its purpose was to eradicate pests that would usually ruin crops. Unfortunately, it had 3 main issues. The first was it took as long as 3 weeks from infection to kill the pest. The second was because of the way it spread. Needing close proximity to spores, it didn't work with any animals that weren't social and spent time around others. And third, it could infect people. And that was the true experiment of Vault 22. Big Mountain, in collaboration with Vault-Tec, wanted to see what would happen in a sealed environment with a recycled air system and a few hundred test subjects. The infection spread fast. Vault dwellers started getting chills, fevers, and a hacking cough caused by the fungus coating the lungs. The fungus sunk deep into the body enough to force it to violently reject any antifungal treatments. Eventually, organs shut down and people died. And then we get to the bad part, because then people got back up again as spore carriers who would attack any uninfected. By 2096, the Vault was in chaos with an airborne plague and literal zombies. The last scientists planned to flood the lowest level with gas and ignite it, going literal scorched earth to try and burn out the infection. But the spore carriers somehow sensed the gas and swarmed the team before they could trigger the blast. By 2096, barely 20 years after the Great War, Vault 22 was lost. The survivors fled north, leaving the door open behind them. The plants grew unchecked, covering the vault and the surrounding area in lush greenery, a stark, horrifying contrast to the surrounding Mojave Desert. Thankfully, the spores aren't seemingly able to spread in the open air, but anyone foolish enough to go inside never comes back. The vault's green exterior lures explorers in, and the spore carriers make sure they stay forever. And the story doesn't even end there. The handful of survivors who escaped fled into Zion National Park, hardened by what they'd seen. They became isolationist, violent, and worse, still infected. Some died of the disease. Others died when a certain very angry army veteran went open season on them after they ate the locals to survive. Their bodies eventually rose again and retreated into Zion's caves, where the fungus could grow undisturbed. As for the last survivors of Vault 22 that fled once again out of Zion, we never hear from them again. But given their social skills and the fact they were infected, I don't think they or anyone else around them had a happy ending. At least Vault 22's horror has a clear ending. The next Vault's tragedy is that nobody remembers it happened at all. Vault 76. The Forgotten Heroes. A spin on a vault not talked about very much on these sorts of videos because of how vanilla it seems. Now you might be saying, but cool, Vault 76 was a control vault. Everyone lived in luxury for 25 years before leaving. And to that, I say yes. But in the words of contemporary philosopher Soulja Boy, have you considered the implications? Because look, Fallout 76 is a fun game. It's the same thing here. Sure, the game is easy for us to play, but imagine what our in-game characters are actually going through. Vault 76's residents, handpicked successful businessmen and women and their kids, were expecting to leave the vault and rebuild West Virginia. At best, the dangers they were prepared for were radiation poisoning, environmental pollution, and some raiders. But when they opened that door on Reclamation Day 2102, what did they find? The scorched plague turning people into crystalline hive mind zombies, scorch beasts, literal dragon-sized mutated bats that scream sonic attacks, the blood eagles torturing people for fun, and oh yeah, everyone who tried to help before them. The responders, the Free States, the Brotherhood of Steel, all dead. But the residents adapted. They cured the scorched plague. They stopped Atlas from destroying Appalachia. They fought raiders and cultists. They built entire settlements. They saved West Virginia. And then what? Nothing. Appalachia is never mentioned again in any later Fallout game. Not once. Yes, that's mostly because 76 came out most recently. But until it's mentioned in a future game, I'm counting its omission as canon. All your victories, curing the scorched plague, saving Appalachia from disaster after disaster, building literal cities from scratch, none of it mattered. Even in Fallout 3, when you go to the pit, a stone's throw from the game area of Fallout 76, and where you actually go in Fallout 76, there's no mention of the Vault 76 dwellers anywhere. Which means, one thing, everything you built became dust, and every sacrifice you made was erased by time. The only thing worse than failing to achieve greatness is achieving it and being completely forgotten. And personally, that's at least disturbing to me. Vault 95, the cruelest relapse. Vault 95 is proof that Vault-Tec didn't just conduct experiments, they crafted psychological torture disguised as rehabilitation. The Vault housed 72 chem addicts and offered a full rehabilitation program. No chems, supportive community, structured recovery, and for 5 years, it worked. Every single resident stayed clean, overcame withdrawals, and built new lives. It was a genuine success story, except one of them wasn't an addict. Randall Gutierrez was a Vault-Tec plant, tasked with monitoring the program and documenting results. And after 5 years, Vault-Tec gave him his final order. Open the hidden chem stash and see what happens. Randall did it. He unlocked a secret compartment filled with every chem imaginable and waited. It didn't take long. One resident found the stash, then another. Within 24 hours, 5 years of sobriety evaporated. Friends turned on each other. Fistfights became brawls. Brawls became murders. Even residents who initially resisted eventually caved when the violence became overwhelming. They figured if everyone else was high and trying to kill them, they might as well get high too. By the end, Vault 95 was a graveyard, bodies scattered through the halls, chems everywhere, and Randall's final terminal entry, cold and clinical, documenting how the subjects failed to maintain sobriety when reintroduced to temptation. What happened to Vault 95? By 2287, the gunners used it as a base of operations, because nothing says defensible position like a vault full of corpses and a dark history. The addiction experiment proved exactly what Vault-Tec wanted, that recovery is fragile and cruelty is easy. And honestly, this might be the most evil vault on this list because they gave people hope just to destroy it. That's not science. That's sadism with a clipboard. Vault 88. The production line? Vault 88 is one of the few times Fallout shows Vault-Tec's cruelty as a repeatable process. Not just a one-off horror story, but a production line for human experimentation. The setup is explicit. Overseen by Dr. Valerie Barstow, the Vault exists to test prototype systems meant for rollout across other vaults after 2078, under the direction of figures tied directly to Vault-Tec's grand societal preservation plan, including Dr. Stanislaus Braun, the same Braun connected to Vault 112. The experiments weren't designed as isolated curiosities. They were intended as mass-produced experiments within experiments. The Vault gives a sharp lens into how Vault-Tec operates. It reveals the infrastructure of experimentation, how the company standardized cruelty so it could be copied, shipped, and scaled. Vault 88's story becomes more disturbing after the Great War because the Vault was never finished, but the experiments can still be revived and deployed on people who never consented to any of it. When you explore Vault 88, you find the construction crew now feral and the Vault split between intact and unfinished sections. But the critical detail is that the experimental data survives elsewhere, stored at the nearby Vault-Tec Regional HQ. That means Barstow isn't stuck reinventing anything. She can recover the archived protocols and restart testing immediately. The only difference is the target population. Not pre-war citizens, but the wastelanders of the Commonwealth, people with fewer protections, fewer choices, and fewer ways to fight back. This reframes Vault-Tec's evil as something even worse than mad science. It's bureaucratic continuity, because society may crumble, but the paperwork survives. And the paperwork is the weapon. Vault 88 shows that Vault-Tec didn't just design experiments. They designed experiments with adjustable ethics. Like cruelty was a feature you could configure depending on what your manager needed that week. The 4 core prototypes, the Power Cycle 1000, Soda Fountain, Phoropter, and Slot Machine, each come with 3 configurations: an overtly abusive Vault-Tec setting, a compromise setting designed by Team Walrus, and a genuinely beneficial version created by Dr. Ted Riley. This isn't accidental. It's a system that turns morality into a menu, harmful, ambiguous, or helpful, all at the flip of a switch. The Vault-Tec versions make the intended purpose unmistakable, maximize compliance, extract productivity, and accept death as an acceptable byproduct. The Power Cycle 1000 can shock riders to squeeze out more power, up to spontaneous combustion and death. The Soda Fountain dispenses appetite-suppressant soda that drives unnatural weight loss and can escalate into fatal refusal to eat. The Phoropter uses subliminal messaging that produces headaches and can kill. And the Slot Machine turns gambling into coercion, manipulating probabilities to trap players in a loss spiral that effectively locks them into indentured servitude. But out of many, if not all, Vault-Tec scientists, Dr. Ted Riley is probably the most ethical pre-war person to ever work for Vault-Tec. Every one of his team's experiments were not only beneficial to Vault-Tec, but to the user as well. The Power Cycle emits essential oils and pleasant music. The Soda Fountain was plain ordinary caffeine, but enhanced to surpass even Nuka-Cola. The Phoropter actually enhanced eyesight, and the Slot Machine could lose the Vault money at the cost of endless winnings. Obviously, Valerie Barstow prefers that the Vault-Tec configurations are used for the experiments. She'll walk out on anyone who only uses the beneficial options devised by Dr. Ted Riley. It took 210 years, but the experiments of Vault 88 could finally be unleashed upon the wasteland. It took 210 years, but the experiments of Vault 88 could finally be unleashed upon the wasteland. And that's the pattern, isn't it? Every vault with an experiment seems designed to fail. But here's the thing that makes the next vault so much worse. It didn't have an experiment at all. No twisted vault tech gimmick, no psychological torture, no hidden agenda. Just a normal vault full of normal people who survived 200 years of nuclear apocalypse perfectly. And then they made one decision that killed them all anyway. Vault 3. Trust fall into death control. Vaults were supposed to be boring. No experiments, no twists. Just people living underground until the surface was safe again. Vault 3 followed that script perfectly. For over 2 centuries, they thrived. Clean water, functioning systems, organized society. Everything Vault Tech promised but almost never delivered. Then in 2281, a water leak forced them to open the door. And here's where the story goes from successful vault to object lesson in Why Trust Gets You Killed. When Wastelanders approached asking for help, Vault 3's residents said yes. They welcomed them in. No weapons checks, no security protocols, no background checks or trial periods, just pure unfiltered trust in the goodness of strangers. Which, in a post-apocalyptic wasteland filled with raiders, cannibals, and people who eat other people's pets for fun, is basically natural selection with extra steps. Except these weren't just any wastelanders. They were the fiends. Drug-addicted psychopaths are so violent they make your average raider look like a mall cop. Led by a maniac named Motor Runner who wears a motorcycle helmet welded shut and commands an army that runs on chems, bloodlust, and bad decisions. The Vault Dwellers, convinced they were helping desperate people, offered food, water, and shelter. They showed the fiends where the armory was kept, where the water purification systems were located, basically handed over a complete tactical map of their own defenses because they thought kindness would be rewarded with kindness. In return, the fiends massacred everyone. Men, women, children. It didn't matter. If you lived in Vault 3, you died in Vault 3. The Vault's halls became an abattoir, and the fiends claimed it as their permanent fortress. The Motor Runner set up shop in the Overseer's office, probably sitting in the same chair where someone once made the decision to trust strangers. By 2281, Vault 3 wasn't a shelter anymore. It's a chem den and murder factory. The NCR wants them gone, but can't root them out because the Vault's defensive position is too good. Turns out when you design a structure to withstand nuclear war, it also does a great job protecting psychotic drug addicts from organized military forces. The NCR eventually sends Ranger Andy to deal with Motor Runner. He gets shot in the leg, barely escapes, and spends the rest of his career in Novak telling people about how the fiends are the worst thing in the Mojave. He's not wrong. So, what's the lesson here? Vault 3 shows that sometimes the deadliest experiment isn't the one Vault Tech designed. It's the one that happens when you survive 200 years of isolation and forget that the wasteland doesn't care about your good intentions. The residents made it through nuclear war, resource scarcity, and 2 centuries underground, only to die because they forgot the first rule of the apocalypse. Never open the door for strangers. Ever. And speaking of doors that should have stayed closed, the next Vault's door was designed to fail from the start. Vault 19, Red vs. Blue Insanity. Vault 19 had 2 overseers, 2 separate sections, red sector, blue sector, and absolutely zero chance of ending well. The experiment was elegant in its simplicity. Induce paranoia through non-violent, non-chemical means, and see what happens when you turn a community against itself without firing a single shot. Vault Tech didn't need drugs or torture. They just needed architecture, psychology, and a willingness to treat human beings like lab rats in a maze. The vault was physically divided. Red residents couldn't access blue areas without clearance. Blue residents were told the red sector was receiving better resources. Neither side could verify the truth because the overseers controlled all information flow. Then the psychological warfare began. Subliminal messages played through the speakers at frequencies just below conscious hearing. High-pitched noises that created anxiety without obvious cause. Lights flickering in patterns that looked like code but meant nothing. Resources mysteriously going missing, with each side blaming the other. And the overseers? They followed Vault Tech's playbook to perfection. Deny everything, gaslight residents who asked questions, encourage suspicion, feed the paranoia until it becomes self-sustaining. The red sector blamed the blue sector for stealing food. The blue sector blamed the red sector for sabotaging water pumps. Neither side realized the real enemy was the system designed to make them destroy each other. One blue sector resident, a man obsessed with sunset sarsaparilla, started collecting bottle caps with blue stars. He became convinced the stars were a message from blue sector leadership, a code, proof of a conspiracy. Others thought he'd lost his mind. He probably had, but the vault's design guaranteed he wouldn't be the last. Paranoia is contagious. One person's delusion becomes another person's theory, becomes a faction's rallying cry. Soon the blue sector had armed patrols. The red sector locked down critical systems. Both sides prepared for a conflict that existed only because Vault-Tec wanted to see if they could manufacture one. Eventually, residents started connecting the dots. The doctor refused to answer questions about inconsistencies in medical records. The overseer played dumb when confronted about missing supplies. The staff became hostile when pressed for transparency. And when people finally figured out they'd been manipulated for years, it was too late to fix the fractures. The vault had been designed to break them, and it succeeded. By 2281, Vault 19 was abandoned except for escaped powder gangers using it as a hideout. The original residents either left or killed each other in the paranoia-fueled violence Vault-Tec engineered from day one. The experiment achieved its goal: prove that you don't need chems or weapons to destroy a society. Just suspicion, isolation, and a little bit of gaslighting. Vault 19 is proof that Vault-Tec understood something terrifying. Humans will do the dirty work themselves if you just give them a reason to be afraid. And if you think paranoia is bad, wait until you meet a vault where the entire society runs on luck. Vault 21. All bets are off. In Vault 21, everything was decided by gambling, leadership, resource distribution, conflict resolution, romantic partnerships. If you had a disagreement, you didn't vote or debate or compromise. You played a game of chance, and the winner decided reality. It sounds insane. It absolutely was insane. But here's the thing that makes Vault 21 so fascinating. It worked. For over 200 years, Vault 21 maintained a functional society where luck replaced hierarchy. No one could hoard power because the next card flip could strip it away. No one could claim superiority because yesterday's winner was tomorrow's loser. Everyone had equal odds. It was the wasteland's weirdest form of democracy, and against all logic, it functioned. People married based on card games. Leaders were chosen by dice rolls. Trade agreements were sealed with blackjack hands. It was chaos masquerading as order, but it kept the vault stable for 2 centuries. Then Robert House showed up. Mr. House, New Vegas's resident techno-dictator, and a man who calculated the exact moment nuclear war would start and positioned himself to survive it. Didn't like the idea of a vault full of people who refused to accept that some humans are inherently worth more than others. So he did what House always does. He bought it. Well, technically he gambled for it. He challenged Vault 21's residents to a game. The winner takes the vault. Loser walks away. Fair and square, by their own rules. He won. Of course he won. You don't bet against a man who turned probability into a science and used it to survive nuclear annihilation. House didn't cheat. He didn't need to. He was just better at math than people who thought luck was a philosophy. House's first order: fill most of the vault with concrete. The lower levels, where the heart of Vault 21's society existed, were permanently sealed, buried in cement like a tomb. The residents were allowed to stay in the upper section, but only if they converted it into a hotel. Their society, their way of life, their entire 2-century experiment in chance-based governance got entombed in construction material. By 2281, Vault 21 was a tourist attraction. Sarah Weintraub runs the hotel, clinging desperately to the memory of what the vault used to be. Visitors come to gamble, sleep in vault-themed rooms, and leave, completely unaware they're walking on a graveyard of a culture that once thrived on randomness. Sarah still wears her Vault 21 jumpsuit, still talks about the old days, still hopes that maybe, someday, the house will let them excavate the lower levels and rebuild what was lost. He won't. House doesn't do sentiment. Vault 21 didn't fail because of violence or radiation or social collapse. It failed because someone richer and smarter showed up and bought it out from under them. And honestly, that's the most realistic dystopia Fallout ever created. Sometimes you don't lose to monsters or nuclear war. You lose to capitalism and a man with better odds. And speaking of dystopias that feel uncomfortably real, the next Vault ran on something even more American than gambling: guns. Lots and lots of guns. Vault 34, the Armory Vault. Vault 34's experiment was straightforward. Give residents unlimited access to weapons and ammunition, then sit back and see what happens. Spoiler alert, nothing good. The Vault's armory was stocked beyond any reasonable need. Rifles, pistols, shotguns, explosives, energy weapons, and ammunition for days. More firepower than a small military base. Enough weapons to arm a small country. And unlike every other vault where security controlled the arsenal, Vault 34's residents could access it freely. At first, it created a sense of security. People felt safe knowing they could defend themselves. Then it created a sense of power. Then it created factions, armed factions, with competing ideas about how the vault should run and the firepower to enforce those ideas violently. The problem with giving everyone guns is that eventually someone's going to use them. And in Vault 34, that moment came faster than anyone expected. Tensions escalated over vault policy. Some residents wanted stricter rationing. Others wanted freedom to use resources as they saw fit. Normally, you'd vote, debate, compromise. But when both sides are armed to the teeth, compromise feels like weakness and voting feels like surrender. The first shooting was an accident. At least, that's what people told themselves. A resident got trigger-happy during an argument. Someone died, and suddenly the vault had crossed a line it couldn't uncross. Firefights broke out in the halls. People died in corridors designed to protect them from nuclear war, but utterly unprepared for civil war. Vault security couldn't control the situation because everyone was equally armed. There was no tactical advantage, no authority that couldn't be challenged with bullets. Then the reactor started failing. Maintenance teams couldn't access it safely because the route passed through contested territory. Both factions refused to allow access, each convinced the other would sabotage critical systems. Radiation began leaking into the vault. Panic set in. The violence escalated. People stopped fighting over ideology and started fighting for survival, and the radiation just kept spreading. A group of residents tried to force open the main door to escape. It wouldn't budge. Whether by accident, design, or sabotage, they were trapped. The radiation kept rising. The fighting continued. People kept dying. By 2281, most of Vault 34's residents had devolved into feral ghouls, mindlessly wandering the irradiated, flooded halls. They attack anything that moves, driven by radiation-induced madness and whatever humanity they once had long since burned away. A small group of survivors, the ones who remained sane, is trapped in the flooded reactor section, sending an SOS that might never be answered. They've been stuck there for who knows how long, surviving on scraps and hope, waiting for rescue that probably won't come. The player eventually faces a choice. Seal the vault to cut off the radiation leak, saving the NCR's sharecropper farms that feed thousands but condemning those survivors to a slow death. Or give the survivors control of the vault's systems, saving them but dooming the farms and everyone who depends on them. There's no good answer. Just two flavors of tragedy, and you get to pick which one you can live with. Vault 34 proves that when you give people unlimited power and no consequences, they'll destroy themselves faster than any external threat ever could. It's not a vault. It's a thought experiment in why the Second Amendment needs context, and why vault tech should never be allowed near social policy. And if unlimited weapons create chaos, the next two vaults prove that gender demographics create something arguably worse. Vault 68, 9999 men and 1 woman. 1 woman, 9999 men. Vault tech's experiment in social collapse through demographic nightmare. We don't know exactly what happened inside. The vault's records are incomplete, destroyed, or deliberately hidden. And frankly, the imagination fills in the gaps with scenarios ranging from bad to apocalyptically horrifying. What we do know, this wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Vault Tech carefully selected residents to create a 999.1 gender ratio and then sealed the door, trapping them in a social experiment designed to fail. Did the woman become a dictator, leveraging scarcity into power? A prisoner, trapped by the very people meant to coexist with her? A religious figure, elevated to mythic status? Did the men form factions fighting for her attention, tearing the vault apart in proxy wars over reproductive rights? Did society collapse into violence within weeks? Or did it take months? Did anyone survive? We don't know. And that uncertainty is almost worse than knowing, because your mind fills in the details. And none of them are good. But here's what we can infer. Nothing good happened. You don't design an experiment like this and expect a happy ending. You design it to document how quickly humanity abandons civilization when the social structure becomes mathematically impossible to sustain. Vault Tech built this vault knowing full well it would destroy everyone inside. They allocated resources, selected residents, built the infrastructure, and then locked the door, fully aware that 1,000 human beings were about to descend into a nightmare. And they did it not because they needed to, but because they wanted data. They wanted to know what would happen. They wanted to compare results with Vault 69 and see if gender changed the outcome. They wanted to fill filing cabinets with reports documenting human suffering. Vault 68 is a ghost. No confirmed survivors, no detailed records, no holotapes explaining the end, just the knowledge that somewhere in the wasteland, 1,000 people were locked in a vault and told to make it work. They didn't. And just to prove Vault Tech played no favorites and had equal opportunity cruelty, they ran the exact same experiment in reverse. Vault 69, 9999 women and 1 man. Vault 69, 1 man, 999 women. The mirror image of Vault 68's horror. Same experiment. Flipped demographics, equally horrifying implications, and the same disturbing lack of detailed records. Again, we don't know the specifics. We We don't know if the man survived the first year. We don't know if the society lasted a week or a decade. We don't know if it ended in violence, despair, exhaustion, or some twisted form of order that barely qualified as civilization. We don't even know if he had a choice in the matter, or if Vault-Tec's experiment required participation whether he wanted it or not. What we do know is Vault-Tec ran this experiment knowing full well it would destroy everyone inside, just like Vault 68. They just wanted to compare the data and see if biological sex changed the trajectory of social collapse. It's clinical, it's detached, it's evil wearing a lab coat and carrying a clipboard, documenting atrocities with the same emotional investment as a grocery list. The fact that Vault-Tec built 2 of these vaults purely to compare results makes it exponentially worse. 1 might be a sick curiosity. 2 is a pattern. 2 is methodology. 2 means someone at Vault-Tec proposed this, someone approved it, someone allocated a budget, and multiple people worked together to condemn 2,000 human beings to gender-imbalanced hell. Both Vault 68 and 69 exist to answer one question. How quickly does a society collapse when you remove the possibility of normal human relationships and family structures? The answer, presumably, is very quickly. These aren't vaults. They're cruelty engines, social experiments that never should have left the brainstorming phase. And the fact that Vault-Tec actually built them, populated them, and sealed them shut proves that the real monsters of Fallout were never the super mutants or Deathclaws. They were the people in suits who signed the paperwork. And if demographic manipulation sounds like psychological warfare, the next Vault tried to reprogram minds entirely through sound. Vault 92, The Musician Massacre. Vault 92 was sold as a paradise for artists, the best musicians in America, handpicked for their talent, given state-of-the-art instruments and recording equipment, and told they'd preserve culture for future generations. A vault where art would survive the apocalypse. They weren't told about the white noise generators hidden in the ventilation system. The experiment used subliminal messaging embedded in constant white noise to create obedient super soldiers who would follow orders without question, even under fire. Reprogram musicians into living weapons through audio manipulation. Vault-Tec partnered with military contractors who believed the human mind was just software waiting to be reprogrammed. Play the right frequencies at the right intervals, and you could overwrite free will with obedience. The white noise played constantly, embedded with hypnotic commands. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The musicians played. They recorded. They held concerts for fellow residents. Life in Vault 92 looked exactly like the paradise Vault-Tec had promised. Then people started acting strange, aggressive, paranoid, violent over minor disagreements. Musicians who'd spent years perfecting their craft suddenly attacked each other with instruments as weapons. The subliminal messages weren't creating soldiers, they were creating psychopaths. Turns out, you can't just upload commands into a human brain and expect clean results. The mind fights back, and when it breaks under pressure, it shatters in unpredictable ways. The Overseer kept pushing. More white noise, stronger subliminal messages, longer exposure times. The experiment had to work. Vault-Tec's orders were explicit. Military contracts depended on results. Failure wasn't an option, even as residents descended into madness. It didn't work. It broke them completely. The musicians turned on each other first, then on the staff, then on anyone they could find. Vault 92 became a slaughterhouse, blood painting the walls where sheet music once hung, instruments scattered among corpses, recording equipment smashed. The Overseer's final logs document desperate attempts to contain the violence, then increasingly frantic realizations that containment was impossible. By 2277, the Vault is silent, except for the echo of old violence. Holotapes document the descent into madness step by horrifying step. Terminals show the Overseer's increasingly desperate attempts to justify continuing the experiment even as people died. Even as it became obvious, the white noise was destroying minds instead of controlling them. One holotape features a musician begging the Overseer to stop the experiment. The Overseer refuses, citing contractual obligations to Vault-Tec and the military. Days later, that same musician's body is found with a violin bow embedded in his skull. Vault 92 failed because Vault-Tec forgot a basic truth. The human mind isn't software. You can't just upload commands and expect obedience. You can't brute force free will with frequencies and subliminal messaging, push too hard, and the mind doesn't comply. It shatters. And Vault-Tec learned that lesson the hard way, written in the blood of people who just wanted to make music. And if Vault 92 shows what happens when you try to control minds through sound, the next Vault shows what happens when you control them through absolute authority. Vault 101, the Forever Vault. No one ever enters, and no one ever leaves. The experiment, create a vault with an all-powerful Overseer and see what happens when that position passes from one dictator to the next, generation after generation, with zero accountability or external oversight. Unlike control vaults that would eventually receive an all-clear signal from Vault-Tec to open and repopulate the surface, Vault 101 was never supposed to open, ever. The residents would live, reproduce, and die underground while Vault-Tec studied how absolute power corrupts absolutely when given literal centuries to fester. For decades, it worked exactly as designed. The Overseer controlled everything: information, resources, social structure, even relationships. Dissent was crushed immediately. Conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was survival. You fell in line or you disappeared. The Overseer's word was law. Not metaphorically, literally. There was no appeals process, no checks and balances, no democracy or representation, just one person with total control over 1,000 lives, passing that control to the next Overseer when they died. Generations were born and died without ever questioning the system. Why would they? It's all they'd ever known. The Overseer said the surface was uninhabitable, so it must be true. The Overseer said the door must never open, so it never did. The Overseer said this was the only way to survive, and nobody had evidence to the contrary. Then, in 2277, everything changed when James, the Lone Wanderer's father, fled the vault. He hacked the door controls and escaped to the surface, shattering the fundamental lie that held Vault 101's society together. The door opened. Residents saw the outside world for the first time in 200 years, and it wasn't the radioactive hellscape the Overseer had described. It was just wasteland, dangerous, sure, but survivable, inhabited even. The Overseer tried desperately to maintain control, but the illusion shattered. If the Overseer had lied about the surface, what else had he lied about? People started questioning, rebelling, demanding answers and accountability that the Overseer couldn't provide without admitting to centuries of manipulation. The social order Vault-Tec had carefully cultivated for 2 centuries collapsed in days. The Overseer's daughter even turned against him, recognizing that absolute power had corrupted her father into a tyrant. Depending on player choices, Vault 101 either opens to the outside world under new leadership, remains sealed with a different Overseer, or falls into chaos and civil war. But the damage is irreversible. The experiment failed the moment someone proved the Overseer wasn't as all-powerful as he claimed. Vault 101's tragedy isn't that it was designed to fail. It's that it succeeded for 200 years before one person's choice destroyed everything. That's not a vault. That's a cult with government funding and 2 centuries of institutional momentum. And if Vault 101 controlled people through authority and isolation, the next vault controlled them through chemistry and terror. Vault 106. The Psychedelic Nightmare. 10 days. That's how long Vault 106 lasted before Vault-Tec pumped psychoactive drugs into the air circulation system. 10 days of normal vault life. 10 days where residents believed they were safe. 10 days before Vault-Tec decided it was time to start the real experiment. The experiment: release hallucinogenic gas into the vault's atmosphere and document what happens when an entire population is forcibly drugged and left to descend into madness together. The gas was released on schedule at 1530 hours on day 10. By 1600 hours, Vault 106 had descended into chaos. Some residents fell into hallucinogenic stupors, collapsed in corridors, seeing things that weren't there and unable to distinguish reality from chemically induced nightmares. Others became violent, paranoid, aggressive, attacking anyone nearby because their drugged minds convinced them everyone was an enemy, a monster, a threat that needed to be eliminated. The security chief tried to contain it, issued emergency orders, told unaffected residents to shelter in place and seal their rooms. It didn't work. The gas was everywhere. You couldn't hide from the air. People tried, sealed doors with duct tape, covered vents with fabric, held wet towels over their faces. It didn't matter. The ventilation system was designed to reach every corner of the vault, and Vault-Tec had designed the delivery system to ensure total exposure. By the end of day 10, Vault 106 was a mass grave in the making, bodies stacked in corridors, evidence of people trying to claw their way through solid rock to escape. A mini-nuke detonated near a cave-in, suggesting someone, in their drug-addled desperation, thought they could blast an exit through the vault walls. They couldn't. The walls held. The residents didn't. By 2277, 2 centuries later, the vault was still contaminated. Whatever compound Vault-Tec used in that gas has lingered in the structure itself, absorbed into the walls and floors and ventilation system. Stepping inside Vault 106 triggers immediate hallucinations. Players see enemies that aren't there. Hostile vault residents attacking from every direction, except they're phantoms. Ghosts created by 200-year-old psychoactive compounds are still potent enough to fracture reality. You fight shadows, shoot at nothing, waste ammunition on threats that never never existed. It's disorienting, terrifying, a glimpse into what Vault 106's residents experienced, except they had no context, no preparation, and no escape. Vault 106 didn't just kill its residents. It became a permanent toxic zone, a monument to Vault-Tec's willingness to destroy minds for data. The experiment's documentation probably still exists somewhere in a filing cabinet, neatly categorized under psychoactive compounds and long-term effects. And speaking of long-term effects gone horribly wrong, the next Vault created an army of something that definitely wasn't human anymore. Vault 108, Gary. Vault 108 had one job: test the viability of human cloning as a way to repopulate the wasteland. They cloned a man named Gary, then they cloned him again, and again. 54 times total. Each clone was designed to be identical. Same DNA, same baseline physiology, same starting point. In theory, they'd create a stable population capable of surviving and rebuilding. In practice, each clone was more violent and mentally unstable than the last. Gary 1 was manageable, functional, could follow basic instructions and interact with staff without incident. Gary 5 showed signs of aggression. Gary 23 died when scientists tried to remove a hermetically sealed device from his arm. They amputated the limb, and he bled out on the operating table while other Garys watched. By Gary 54, the clones were actively hostile, attacking anyone who wasn't Gary, communicating only with each other, forming a hive mind united by violence and an apparent hatred for non-clone humans. The scientists tried to maintain control. They disposed of the more violent clones to make room for new test subjects, hoping that maybe the next batch would be more stable. Maybe they'd made a mistake in the process. Maybe Gary 55 would be different. The Garys had other plans. They rebelled, coordinated, used their numbers and intimate knowledge of the Vault to overwhelm security and slaughter the scientific staff. Turns out, when you create dozens of clones of the same person, they develop a group cohesion that makes resistance nearly impossible. The last terminal entries document scientists barricading themselves in offices while Garys pounded on the doors. Then the entries stop. Draw your own conclusions. By 22 Senseverstieven, Vault 108 is populated entirely by hostile Gary clones who communicate exclusively by saying their own name in different inflections, tones, and volumes. Gary could mean hello, or attack, or hunger, or warning, or excitement. Context is everything when your entire vocabulary is one word, and the Garys have apparently developed an entire language out of that limitation. The clones don't age normally. They've survived 200 plus years through some unknown mechanism, seemingly sustained by whatever cloning process created them. They roam the halls in groups, attacking intruders, living in a vault that's half tomb, half cloning lab, surrounded by the corpses of the scientists they murdered. Vault 108 answers a question nobody should have asked. What happens when you create dozens of mentally unstable clones and trap them underground with the people who made them? Answer: Gary. Just Gary. Forever Gary. An army of clones unified by madness, violence, and a single name repeated endlessly through irradiated corridors. And if cloning created monsters, the next Vault created corpses through nothing more than corporate negligence and broken promises. Vault 111, frozen in time. Vault 111 promised safety through cryogenic preservation. Freeze the residents until the surface is habitable, then wake them up to rebuild civilization as American heroes. They didn't mention the waking up part was entirely optional and subject to change. When the bombs fell on October 23rd, or 2077, residents of Sanctuary Hills rushed to Vault 111, terrified and desperate. They were told to enter cryopods for decontamination. It was a lie. The pods were cryogenic freezers, and the decontamination was indefinite suspension. The residents entered the pods believing they'd sleep through the worst of the radiation and emerge to a new world in a few years, maybe a decade at most. Instead, they became lab rats in a long-term stasis experiment designed to test human cryogenic preservation. Vault-Tec wanted to know if humans could survive centuries of frozen suspension, and the only way to find out was to freeze people and wait. After 180 days, the Vault staff expected an all-clear signal from Vault-Tec headquarters telling them to begin revival procedures. It never came. Vault-Tec was gone, destroyed in the nuclear war they'd helped orchestrate. Supplies dwindled. The staff panicked. The overseer refused to open the vault or wake the residents, insisting radiation levels were still too high, and they needed to wait for official authorization that would never arrive. The staff mutinied, killed the overseer, tried to leave the vault and seek help. Most died in the wasteland within days, completely unprepared for life outside. The rest died fighting over the vault's remaining supplies. The residents, still frozen, still asleep, still completely unaware that everyone meant to protect them was dead, and they were trapped in mechanical coffins, slowly failing. In 2227, 150 years after the bombs fell, the Institute arrived. They needed genetic material uncontaminated by radiation. Vault 111 was perfect. They unfroze one couple, Nate and Nora. They murdered Nate in front of his wife. They kidnapped his infant son, Sean. Then they refroze Nora as a backup sample and leave, sealing the vault behind them. Everyone else remained frozen, dying slowly as life support systems failed one by one. Asphyxiation, power loss, equipment malfunction. 10 years, frozen, only to suffocate in their sleep, never knowing they'd survived nuclear war only to be killed by corporate negligence. By 2287, when the sole survivor finally wakes up, everyone else in the vault is dead. Frozen corpses preserved in their pods like museum exhibits. Families who thought they were being saved, employees who thought they were helping, all dead because Vault-Tec abandoned them. Vault 111 wasn't designed to save anyone. It was designed to test long-term cryogenic preservation, and the residents were expendable data points in an experiment that outlived the company that created it. The sole survivor lived because the Institute needed a backup sample. Everyone else was just inventory, filed under acceptable losses in a report nobody will ever read, and that's the legacy of Vault-Tec. Frozen corpses, psychotic clones, demographic nightmares, and 200 years of proof that humanity's worst enemy has always been itself. If you survived this deep dive into nuclear-powered corporate evil, check out what happened to every Vault survivor in Fallout. Spoiler, very few of them had happy endings. And that's it. We're done. If you enjoyed this video and want to see what happened to every Vault survivor in Fallout, click the video on screen. Vault 8. This was one of Vault-Tec's rare control vaults with minimal interference, designed to open after 10 years and repopulate Nevada using a Garden of Eden creation kit. The experiment was to see if a vault could actually function as advertised, rather than as a twisted psychological torture chamber. Vault 8's residents successfully founded Vault City, a technologically advanced settlement that became one of the most prosperous communities in the post-war world. However, success came with its own problems. Vault City developed serious class issues, with pure-strain vault dwellers considering themselves superior to wasteland outsiders. The vault shows that even when Vault-Tec experiments work as intended, human nature finds ways to create new problems. Vault 8 proves that successful vault experiments can still produce societies with serious superiority complexes. If you thought class warfare was disturbing, the next vault turned democracy into a death sentence. Vault 11. This vault features one of the most psychologically twisted experiments in the entire series. Residents had to annually vote to sacrifice one dweller to the vault's computer, or everyone would supposedly be killed. The experiment was designed to test morality and social pressure, creating a society built on murder and betrayal. Elections became campaigns of character assassination as people tried to nominate their enemies for death. The vault descended into paranoia, violence, and political manipulation until only 5 residents remained. The ultimate irony? The computer's final message revealed that refusing to sacrifice anyone would have let them all go free. Vault 11 represents Vault-Tec's cruelest lesson about the corruption of democratic institutions under extreme pressure. Vault 11 shows that the most horrific societies are the ones where murder becomes a civic duty, but the next Vault's experiment was literally built into its fundamental design. Vault 12. This vault's door was purposely left unsealed to expose residents to massive amounts of radiation, turning them into ghouls as part of a long-term study on radiation's effects. The experiment created Necropolis, a city populated by both intelligent ghouls and feral ones driven mad by radiation exposure. Vault 12 in Fallout 1 became foundational to ghoul lore in the series, showing how Vault-Tec was willing to condemn entire populations to horrific mutation just to gather scientific data. The Vault represents one of the more straightforward experiments. No psychological manipulation needed when you can just leave the door open and watch people slowly transform into living corpses. Vault 12 proves that sometimes the simplest experiments are the most cruel. If you thought radiation exposure was bad, the next vault was designed to never let anyone leave. Vault 13. The home vault of Fallout's original protagonist was designed to stay closed for 200 years, serving as a future genetic reserve for the Enclave's post-war plans. The experiment tested long-term isolation and genetic preservation, but the water chip failure, after just 80 years, forced the Vault dweller into the wasteland. Vault 13 showcases the Enclave's long-term planning and complete indifference toward their human test subjects. They were willing to keep people trapped underground for 2 centuries just to maintain a pure human gene. The Vault's failure ironically launched the entire Fallout series, proving that even the most carefully planned experiments can be undone by simple mechanical failure. Vault 13 shows that the Enclave's idea of genetic preservation was basically a 200-year prison sentence, but the next vault decided to pack as much conflict as possible into one space. Vault 15. This vault was populated with residents chosen for extreme ideological diversity and designed to stay closed for 50 years. The experiment tested how different belief systems would interact under pressure, and the results were exactly as violent as you'd expect. 4 major factions eventually splintered off from the vault, including the founders of both the Khans Raider tribe and the New California Republic. Vault 15 demonstrates Vault-Tec's understanding that ideological differences become exponentially more dangerous in confined spaces. The vault essentially became a pressure cooker for political extremism, proving that diversity without common ground leads to inevitable conflict. Vault 15 proves that putting people with opposite worldviews in a confined space creates future warlords and politicians. If you thought ideological conflict was destructive, the next vault's fate remains largely mysterious. Vault 17. Details about this vault's experiment are mostly unknown, but all residents were reportedly abducted by supermutants from the Master's army in Fallout 1. The vault is connected to Lily Bowen's tragic backstory in New Vegas. She was transformed from a grandmother into a Nightkin supermutant. Vault 17 represents one of the series' unsolved mysteries. We know something terrible happened, but the specific experiment remains hidden. The vault shows how some of Vault-Tec's experiments were interrupted by external forces, though the residents probably didn't consider super mutant abduction an improvement over whatever psychological torture was planned. Vault 17 shows that sometimes being kidnapped by super mutants is preferable to completing a Vault-Tec experiment. But the next vault decided to turn architecture into psychological warfare. Vault 19. This vault was divided into red and blue sectors to foster paranoia and rivalry between different groups of residents. The experiment tested how artificial divisions and color-coded tribalism would affect a closed society, and the results were predictably violent. The vault eventually collapsed from internal conflict as residents fought over imaginary differences created by nothing more than room assignments. Vault 19 in New Vegas demonstrates how easily people can be manipulated into hating each other over completely arbitrary distinctions. The experiment shows that humans will find ways to create conflict even when they have no real reasons to fight. Vault 19 proves that people will literally kill each other over the color of their living quarters. If you thought color-based warfare was absurd, the next vault turned every decision into a game of chance. Vault 21. This vault required all disputes to be resolved through gambling and games of chance rather than violence or democratic processes. The experiment tested whether a society based entirely on luck could function, and it actually worked surprisingly well until Robert House won the entire vault in a card game. The vault was eventually converted into a casino hotel in New Vegas, making it one of the few vault experiments that continued operating in its original form. Vault 21 represents Vault-Tec's exploration of alternative governance systems, showing that sometimes random chance produces better results than human judgment. Vault 21 shows that a society based on pure luck somehow works better than most political systems. But the next vault decided to experiment with agriculture in the most dangerous way possible. Vault 22. This vault was dedicated to cultivating aggressive, genetically enhanced crops designed to resist harsh post-apocalyptic conditions. The agricultural experiment went horribly wrong when the enhanced plants unleashed a devastating spore infection that killed or transformed the entire vault population. Vault 22 in New Vegas is now overrun by deadly plant creatures and filled with toxic spores that turn people into plant-human hybrids. The vault represents Vault-Tec's willingness to weaponize nature itself, showing how attempts to improve food production can create biological nightmares instead. Vault 22 proves that playing God with agriculture creates killer plants that make regular radiation seem friendly. If you thought murderous plants were bad, the next vault decided to test human limits through simple overcrowding. Vault 27. This vault was crammed with 0 people instead of its intended capacity of 0, creating an overcrowding experiment that tested resource scarcity and social pressure. The results were exactly what you'd expect. Resource shortages led to rioting, social collapse, and death as residents fought over food, water, and living space. Vault 27 demonstrates that sometimes the most effective experiments are the simplest ones. You don't need elaborate psychological manipulation when you can just pack too many people into a small space and watch them tear each other apart. The vault shows how quickly civilization breaks down when basic needs aren't met. But the next vault decided to remove adults from the equation entirely. Vault 29. This vault only allowed children under 15 to enter, with all adults barred from residence. The children were raised by an AI called Mother Eve in an experiment studying youth development without adult guidance. Vault 29 represents one of Vault-Tec's most ethically questionable experiments, essentially orphaning hundreds of children to see how they'd develop in isolation. The experiment tested whether artificial intelligence could successfully replace human parenting and social structures. The Vault's ultimate fate remains uncertain. It demonstrates how Vault-Tec was willing to sacrifice entire generations of children for scientific data. If you thought AI parenting was disturbing, the next Vault decided to arm everyone and see what happened. Vault 34. This Vault's armory was deliberately overstocked with weapons and ammunition, but featured a faulty door that could easily open, allowing residents to leave whenever they wanted. The experiment tested the effects of excessive militarization on a supposedly sealed society. Internal conflict eventually broke out as heavily armed factions fought for control, and radiation leaks from the damaged reactor killed or mutated most of the population. Vault 34 demonstrates how access to unlimited firepower combined with cabin fever creates the perfect recipe for civil war. But the next Vault took deprivation to its most basic level. Vault 36. This Vault provided only thin, watery gruel as food for all residents, creating a chronic hunger experiment that tested malnutrition's effects on society. The residents faced constant hunger, malnutrition, and the psychological stress of never having a satisfying meal. Vault 36 represents Vault-Tec's exploration of basic human needs. What happens when you meet the absolute minimum calorie requirements but provide no food satisfaction or variety? The experiment tested whether a society could function when its members were technically alive but constantly miserable from hunger. The Vault shows how quickly social bonds break down when everyone is always thinking about their next meal. If you thought bad food was depressing, the next Vault literally kept everyone in the dark. Vault 42. This Vault permitted no light bulbs greater than 40 watts, forcing residents to live in constant dimness. The experiment tested the long-term effects of extreme low-light conditions and sensory restriction on human psychology. Residents suffered from chronic frustration, depression, and negative psychological impacts from never experiencing proper lighting. Vault 42 demonstrates how something as simple as inadequate lighting can become psychological torture when extended indefinitely. The Vault shows that Vault-Tec understood how environmental factors could be weaponized against human well-being without any obvious mechanical devices or chemicals. But the next Vault decided to add a wild card to the social experiment. Vault 43. This Vault was populated with 20 men, 10 women, and 1 panther, creating what's considered a deliberately absurd scenario to test how residents would cope with a wild predator in their midst. The experiment's outcome is unclear, but it represents Vault-Tec's willingness to introduce completely unpredictable variables into their social studies. Vault 43 shows how the company wasn't above adding literal wild animals to their human experiments, possibly just to see if desperate people could find ways to coexist with apex predators. The Vault demonstrates that some experiments were designed more for shock value than scientific merit. Vault 43 proves that Vault-Tec thought adding a panther to any social situation would make it more interesting. If you thought wild animals were chaotic, the next Vault let artificial intelligence play deadly games with human leadership. Vault 51. This Vault replaced traditional human oversight with a Zax-class AI that manipulated residents into constant competitions to determine leadership fitness. The AI created cycles of conflict by continually changing the Prospeld AI rules and encouraging deadly competition among residents. Vault 51's experiment formed the basis for Fallout 76's nuclear winter scenario, where the AI's manipulation created an endless battle royale among the survivors. But the next Vault decided to test human patience through perpetual mechanical failure. Vault 53. This Vault had all its equipment intentionally designed to fail at regular intervals, forcing residents into endless cycles of repair and maintenance. The experiment tested human responses to chronic frustration and technical incompetence, creating a society where nothing ever worked properly for long. The Vault shows that sometimes the most effective way to break people's spirits is to make their basic tools unreliable. If you thought broken equipment was frustrating, the next Vault removed entertainment entirely. Vault 55. This Vault entered without any entertainment tapes or media, forcing residents to provide their own recreation in a complete intellectual deprivation experiment. The Vault tested how people would cope with absolute boredom and whether they could create their own cultural activities without external input. Residents were forced to develop their own games, stories, and social activities while dealing with the psychological strain of monotony. Vault 55 represents Vault-Tec's understanding that entertainment isn't just luxury, it's essential for mental health. The experiment shows how quickly people deteriorate when they have nothing to distract them from their circumstances. But the next Vault decided that bad entertainment was worse than no entertainment. Vault 56. This Vault contained only entertainment tapes of a single terrible comedian, forcing residents to endure the same awful comedy routines repeatedly. The experiment tested whether bad cultural input was worse than no input at all, subjecting people to comedy so unfunny it became torture. Vault 56 represents the logical extension of Vault 55's experiment, proving that humans need quality entertainment, not just noise to fill the silence. If you thought bad entertainment was cruel, the next vault created extreme gender imbalances. Vault 68. This vault was populated with 999 men and just one woman, creating a severe gender imbalance that resulted in social, psychological, and genetic crises. The experiment tested how society would manage under enforced demographic extremes, essentially creating a pressure cooker of sexual frustration and competition. The single woman faced impossible social pressure, while the men competed desperately for her attention. Vault 68 proves that extreme gender imbalances create societies built on desperation and conflict, and its counterpart vault flipped the script entirely. Vault 69. This vault featured 999 women and one man, testing the reverse scenario of Vault 68's gender imbalance experiment. While the exact outcomes aren't fully documented, the premise created similar social pressures and genetic bottlenecks from the opposite direction. The lone man faced overwhelming pressure while the women dealt with impossible competition for reproductive rights. If you thought gender imbalances were unethical, the next vault turned childhood into a eugenics program. Vault 75. This vault posed as a safe haven for children under Malden Middle School, but secretly implemented one of the most brutal eugenics programs in the series. Staff separated children from parents by executing adults on arrival, then subjected kids to extreme physical and mental testing. At age 18, failed subjects were killed while superior specimens had their genetic material harvested for further experimentation. Some successful subjects were promoted to staff positions to continue the cycle. Eventually, the enhanced subjects staged an uprising and overthrew their tormentors. Vault 75 in Fallout 4 represents Vault-Tech's most openly genocidal experiment, focused on creating super soldiers through child abuse and murder. But even that wasn't the darkest Vault experiment. Vault 76. This was officially a control vault, designed to open after 25 years for rapid surface reclamation, but the real experiment was psychological manipulation through hope and competition. The vault indoctrinated its 500 best and brightest residents to believe they alone were capable of rebuilding America, fostering extreme competitiveness and ambition. Overseers received ambiguous instructions about reclaiming nuclear silos, essentially programming vault dwellers to become post-war weapons of mass destruction. Vault 76 in Fallout 76 represents the most insidious experiment, using patriotism and hope as tools for manipulation. Vault 76 proves that the most effective brainwashing uses hope and pride instead of fear and despair. If you thought patriotic manipulation was subtle, the next vault went for direct biological warfare. Vault 87. This vault subjected residents to forced evolutionary virus experimentation in an attempt to create super soldiers through forced mutation. Most subjects died horribly or became super mutants, losing their intelligence and humanity in the process. Vault 87 became the source of the Capital Wasteland's super mutant population in Fallout 3, showing how one vault's failed experiment could terrorize an entire region for centuries. The vault represents Vault-Tech's willingness to use residents as test subjects for biological weapons development. The experiment demonstrates that some scientific research is so unethical it creates monsters that outlive their creators. Vault 87 shows that trying to improve humanity through forced evolution creates mindless giants who hate everything. But the next vault was designed to test experimental technology on unwilling subjects. Vault 88. This vault served as a prototype facility for testing next-generation vault technology and experimental add-ons on residents. The vault was unfinished when the bombs dropped, but in Fallout 4's Vault-Tech Workshop DLC, players can complete the twisted experiments themselves. Vault 88 represents Vault-Tech's ultimate goal, turning human beings into test subjects for whatever new torture devices they could invent. The Vault shows how the company planned to use Vault residents as beta testers for increasingly sophisticated forms of psychological and physical manipulation. The experiment proves that Vault-Tech saw every human being as potential laboratory equipment. Vault 88 proves that Vault-Tech's final goal was turning every Vault dweller into a living test dummy. If you thought direct experimentation was cruel, the next Vault weaponized creativity itself. Vault 92. This Vault was populated entirely by musicians and subjected to audio experiments including white noise exposure and subliminal message brainwashing. The experiment tested whether creativity could be controlled and weaponized through sound-based psychological conditioning. The audio manipulation caused madness and violence among residents until the vault was eventually overrun by wildlife. Vault 92 in Fallout 3 represents Vault-Tech's attempt to turn art into a weapon of social control. Vault 92 proves that even music becomes evil when Vault-Tech gets involved. But the next vault tried the opposite approach with pacifism. Vault 94. This vault was designed as a social experiment featuring a pacifist, communal society where no weapons were allowed, and all residents were taught to reject violence completely. The experiment tested whether pure non-violence could survive in the post-apocalyptic world, and the results were tragically predictable. Most residents perished after repeated external attacks and internal strife when their idealistic principles met wasteland reality. Vault 94 in Fallout 76 serves as a tragic example of how noble ideals often can't survive contact with brutal circumstances. The vault shows that Vault-Tech was interested in testing the limits of human goodness as much as human evil. If you thought testing pacifism was cruel, the next vault weaponized addiction recovery. Vault 95. This vault housed former drug addicts trying to recover from their addictions, but after several years of successful rehabilitation, a large stash of chems was revealed to study relapse rates. The experiment deliberately sabotaged people's recovery efforts to observe how addiction would reassert itself under pressure. Most residents re-addicted themselves, leading to chaos, violence, and tragedy as their hard-won sobriety was destroyed by Vault-Tech's manipulation. Vault 95 in Fallout 4 represents one of the most psychologically cruel experiments, giving people hope for recovery then deliberately destroying it for scientific data. Vault 95 shows that Vault-Tech thought the best way to study addiction was to deliberately cause relapses. But the next vault decided to experiment with environmental conservation. Vault 96. This Ark Vault housed a small group of scientists tasked with preserving animal and plant life for post-war repopulation, but the AI secretly enforced harsh productivity quotas and punished failure with poison gas. When scientists attempted to destroy the controlling AI, it responded by gassing the entire vault population. The preserved animals and plants eventually escaped when the vault doors opened, creating new mutated species throughout Appalachia. Vault 96 in Fallout 76 shows how even environmental conservation becomes twisted when filtered through Vault-Tech's corporate mentality. If you thought environmental protection was noble, the next vault was designed to never let anyone experience freedom. Vault 101. This vault was designed never to open, creating a permanent study of life under autocratic rule by the Overseer. The experiment tested how long people could be kept in isolated dictatorship without rebellion or psychological breakdown. Eventually, manipulation and unrest led to rebellion and the player character's escape in Fallout 3. Vault 101 represents one of the series' most recognizable experiments, the complete denial of human freedom disguised as safety and security. The vault shows how easily protection can become imprisonment when those in charge have absolute power. But the next vault decided to drive everyone insane with chemistry. Vault 106. This vault released psychoactive drugs into the air supply after just 10 days, causing residents to experience hallucinations and violent behavior without any warning or explanation. The experiment tested the effects of involuntary chemical manipulation on human psychology and social structure. Inhabitants became completely deranged, with drug-induced hallucinations leading to violence and the complete breakdown of society. Vault 106 in Fallout 3 represents one of the most straightforward experiments: chemical warfare against the vault's own residents. The vault shows how quickly civilization collapses when reality becomes unreliable. If you thought chemical manipulation was horrific, the next vault created an army of clones. Vault 108. This vault featured a cloning lab that produced dozens of mentally unstable clones named Gary, while the Overseer was given terminal cancer and the power systems were designed to fail halfway through operation. The experiment tested what would happen when cloning technology was left unsupervised in a failing system. The Gary clones eventually overwhelmed the scientific staff and killed most residents, now wandering the vault, endlessly repeating their own name. Vault 108 in Fallout 3 demonstrates how cloning experiments become horror shows when combined with inadequate oversight and failing infrastructure. But the next vault froze time itself. Vault 111. This vault placed all residents in cryogenic stasis under false pretenses, telling them it was for decontamination while actually testing the effects of long-term freezing on human subjects. The experiment tested whether humans could be successfully preserved for future use without their knowledge or consent. Power failures and staff deaths led to most residents dying in their frozen sleep, with only the sole survivor emerging 200 years later to begin Fallout 4. Vault 111 shows that Vault-Tec thought the best way to preserve humanity was to freeze them without permission. If you thought cryogenic imprisonment was cruel, the next vault created digital hell. Vault 112. This vault placed residents in virtual reality pods controlled by the sadistic Dr. Braun, who used the simulation to torture them for his own amusement for over 200 years. The experiment tested how long human consciousness could survive in virtual environments while being subjected to endless psychological torment. Residents lived in the Tranquility Lane simulation where they could experience death and trauma repeatedly without dying, creating perfect psychological torture. Vault 112 in Fallout 3 represents the ultimate fusion of technology and sadism, using virtual reality to create personalized hell for every resident. But the next vault decided to test class warfare directly. Vault 114. This vault was designed to house social elites in drastically underfunded and uncomfortable conditions, while being overseen by someone specifically chosen for inexperience and incompetence. The experiment tested how wealthy, privileged people would react to sudden poverty and poor leadership. The vault was never fully occupied when the Great War began, but it represents Vault-Tec's interest in studying class conflict and social reversal. Vault 114 proves that Vault-Tec thought the best way to study privilege was to take it away and watch people suffer. And finally, the most openly elitist experiment, Vault 118. This vault provided ultimate luxury to a handful of wealthy and creative residents, while others served as their staff, testing class conflict and division within a closed system. The experiment examined whether extreme inequality could be maintained indefinitely in confined spaces. In Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, the Vault has become a murder mystery setting among the roboticized upper class, who continue their class-based society even after death. Vault 118 represents Vault-Tec's study of how economic inequality functions under extreme conditions, proving that class warfare continues even when everyone is technically dead. From democracy turned deadly to virtual reality torture chambers, Vault-Tec's experiments represent the systematic study of every possible way to break human society. Each vault tested different variables: overcrowding, isolation, chemical manipulation, artificial scarcity, technological dependence, and social engineering to determine how much suffering humans could endure before civilization collapsed. The vaults prove that the most dangerous enemy of humanity isn't radiation or mutants, but human curiosity without moral boundaries. If you enjoyed this video and want to see every power armor model explained, click the video on the screen. Almost every vault in Fallout is horrifying, because that's the point. They were meant to test what people would do in horrible situations and hide some of the most disturbing mysteries. Some will make you question the sanity of the devs that created them. So, with that cheerful note out of the way, let's go traumatize ourselves. The all clear. Clearance that never came. You know what might be the cruelest lie Vault-Tec ever told? It's not the experiments. It wasn't the marketing. Not even the vague and sometimes threatening excuse of, it's for your own good. It was the idea that one day, someone would press a button, speak into a microphone, or even just play a recorded message, and the people of the vault would hear an all clear, a signal that says, okay, it's safe now, open the door. Because across Fallout, we keep seeing vaults that were clearly built around that expectation. A timer, a schedule, a plan for something to happen that would make everything okay again. Restore things to how they once were, but then nothing. There's no broadcast. There's no coordinated reopening. No instances or implications of a Phase 2. Not even an annoying ad break from Vault-Tec to remind you that help is on the way. A better life underground? More like a better burial. Our first big mystery may sound simple, but in reality, it's huge. Was there ever an all clear at all? Or was it always a story Vault-Tec told to keep people compliant? Because once you start looking, the evidence doesn't just point one way. It points in multiple directions. And that's what makes this scary. The promise of wait it out, then rebuild, that never came true for many, if anyone. Here's something to think about. Most vaults only make psychological sense if the residents believed the door would open eventually. Vault-Tec didn't sell the vaults as tombs. They sold them for survival, a temporary shelter for a permanent future. And across the series, you see vaults built with long-term infrastructure, education, medical wings, and social spaces. Like the vault is supposed to be a bridge, not a coffin. That only works if the residents believe there's a finish line, an end to the waiting, a moment where the vault becomes the seed of the next world. But here's the problem with that line of logic. Fallout also shows vaults where the finish line was never real. Simply put, some vaults had the open sesame Sesame code baked in, while others never had code to open at all, or were only to open after the lab rats had completed their required task. That's because the Vault program doesn't behave like one unified plan. It behaves like multiple plans wearing the same logo. For instance, you've got vaults that open on a schedule, clearly meant to rejoin the surface at a specific point. Vault 8, Vault 13, and Vault 76 come to mind, and then you've got vaults with orders that effectively translate to staying sealed indefinitely, even when the outside world becomes survivable. Vaults 101, 81, and 51 represent that mindset. So if a single all-clear signal existed, why would Vault-Tec need both? Why build some vaults with explicit or implied ultimate goals of rebuilding humanity, and others that come off like do not enter, dead inside? Let's think ahead here, because once you see that inconsistency, the mystery shifts from why didn't they open to who was supposed to tell them to open in the first place. That brings us to the conveniently missing button. Who was really holding the all clear? First, let's review. An all clear is a chain of authority, and Fallout is full of both broken and connected chains. For an all clear to work, somebody has to survive the war with enough power to monitor conditions, communicate with vaults, and enforce the plan. That means infrastructure. That means continuity. You know who I'm talking about. Yet we don't see that second act in a clean, centralized way. We see fragments, we see isolated instructions, we see vaults that 90% of the time only open because something goes wrong. Equipment failure, internal collapse, outside interference, anything except a smooth exit, which strongly suggests one of three things. 1. The all-clear system existed for every vault and continuously failed outside of a few exceptions. 2. It existed for all vaults, but was selective on who left and who stayed. Or 3. It never existed, not for every individual vault at least, because the vaults were never built for rescue. They were built for containment. One thing is certain, regardless if Vault-Tec intended for the all-clear signal to go off, or if it was only for a select few, the next mystery is far more sinister. Data collection, research, or reassurance? Alright, so the all-clear signal never came for a lot of vaults, and we know the stories of those that did get the signal, or at least thought they would get it. That's all fine and dandy. But Vault-Tec still had one reason to build all this. Data. Not just the kind of data that you tend to scroll down to the end to press accept or turn off cookies on. The kind of data that Vault-Tec thought justified putting hundreds of people into confined spaces to conduct terrible, or at least unethical experiments on them. Let's get into our next mystery. If every vault was an experiment, where did the results go? Because you don't spend billions, even trillions, building a continent-wide series of combination home and laboratory just to leave the paperwork in a basement terminal or piled up on a desk somewhere in the many abandoned or destroyed levels of the vaults we explore. Once you take a deeper look inside how Vault-Tec tested and collected its data, the ways vaults either succeed or collapse start looking less like vaults went wrong, and more like someone was supposed to be watching. Let's think. Vault experiments only make sense if Vault-Tec had a way to collect and compare outcomes. Most vaults aren't simply weird living conditions or stuffy lab coat-filled geek centers. They're structured tests, long-term, decades and centuries in the making, controlled variables, overseer, authority, lots of terminals, notebooks, and logbooks, surveys, medical records, behavioral notes, the kind of stuff that's useless to many unless it gets compiled into a bigger picture. So either Vault-Tec had a collection system, or the entire program was just corporate sadism with extra steps. And we know Vault-Tec too well for it to simply be corporate sadism, most of the time. Realistically, there are only a few ways Vault-Tec could have done it. Number 1. Central collection, pre-war style. Vault-Tec planned to gather everything through a central authority. Pre-war America in Fallout loves centralized control. Government contracts, corporate networks, regional HQs, layers upon layers of managers. It would be totally on brand for Vault-Tec to say every vault reports up a chain. After all, many vaults operated under the assumption that either there would never be a nuclear war, or that any situation in a real nuclear war would be far less worse than it turned out to be. Overseer files get sent via email. Data gets copied and stapled together. Reports go to a regional office, then to a main hub. That would mean the vaults were never the end goal, which we already know is obvious. They were field stations. The real drop-off point was a location revealed to us as far back as Fallout 2, the Enclave Vault Research Control, listed as still active at the time the game takes place. Except that the moment the bombs drop, this method has a flaw, a big one. Humans don't survive long enough to manage Phase 2. If the collection plan relied on people doing their jobs, it collapses instantly after October 23, 2077. Even if some executive figures survived, you'd need transport transport, security, stable power, working communications, and a staffed operation that can last centuries. Not days, not months, not years, centuries. Now, if you've ever explored the wasteland, and let's face it, the outside world is basically a tutorial on what happens when supply chains die, meaning that if and when the data was ever collected, it probably wasn't because somebody drove around with a clipboard. Option number 1 obviously doesn't work, so let's get into option number 2. Now, this is one that, when you hear it, simply feels like the real Vault-Tec solution. Automated uplinks and silent telemetry, Vault-Tec could have, and even did, built the vaults to report automatically. You don't need a courier or 6 if you have a network. You don't need a manager if you have a system that just pings home at a designated point in time. Could be once a week, or it could be once the experiment has run its course and failed or succeeded. Basic stuff like population counts, medical metrics, incident reports, resource consumption, anything that could be boiled down into numbers and transmitted. You can imagine Vault-Tec loving this because it keeps subjects unaware. They don't feel watched, but they are. On every camera in the hallway, on every word they type on a terminal, even when they're asleep. If this is the method they used, then every vault wasn't just a shelter, it was a sensor, a data node, a living spreadsheet. And that leads to the creepiest question of this section. If the vaults were transmitting, who was receiving it? The receiver problem. Vault-Tec, the government, or something else? A signal implies a listener, and Fallout is full of potential listeners that never announce themselves. It could have been Vault-Tec corporate. It could have been the Enclave. It could have been the Zetans or other aliens overhead planning to experiment or conquer our world. The real reason this mystery works is because the games keep showing you pieces of oversight, notes that imply supervision, protocols that imply reporting, systems that imply external control, without ever showing you the clean HQ that ties it all together. When you eliminate the impossible and improbable, only 2 possibilities are left. Either the receiver died, or the receiver survived and stayed hidden. But there's one more possibility that explains something important. The third and final option is this. The simplest explanation, really. The data never left because it was meant to be retrieved later. Vault-Tec might have planned a physical post-war retrieval operation, not a live network. Think about it. If you're expecting to reclaim America later, you don't need the data right away. You just need it preserved. And so you store it locally. You lock it behind overseer access. You build redundancies, you make sure it survives time. Then when the vaults open, the collection begins. A team comes through and scoops it all up, clean and intact. That would turn vaults into time capsules, waiting for a landlord who would never need to show up. But here's the twist that makes this whole mystery feel personal, as though it was meant for someone. If the data was supposed to be retrieved, why do we, the player, keep finding it? That's the mystery, isn't it? As far as its show, it's because nobody ever came. Somebody came and only took some of it. Or somebody is still collecting it, and we're just too late to see the tracks. And if that last one is true, then the Vault program never ended. It just went quiet. A doozy of a revelation, huh? But our next big mystery might cause you to scratch your head further than you were before. Unfinished vaults. Incomplete versus incompetent. Okay, so if the all clear never came, and the data pipeline is still a question mark, what gives? How is Vault-Tec both this monolithic entity responsible for so much in the world of Fallout, yet can't even create a working product without at least something going wrong? Right there is the next Vault mystery. Don't worry, it'll sound obvious once you hear it asked out loud. What about the vaults that weren't even finished? Fallout loves showing you Vault-Tec's grand plan like it was this clean, controlled machine. In spite of that, the Wasteland keeps revealing something messier. Some vaults weren't sealed masterpieces. In fact, some were little more than construction sites when the world ended. Because once you ask this, you're not asking what was the experiment. You're asking how many vaults were never ready to run the experiment at all? Or worse, what if the fact they weren't complete was the experiment? Despite all the billboards, radio ads, logos you see everywhere, the network of 122 known vaults wasn't complete when the bombs fell. Vault-Tec sells the vaults like a finished safety net, keeping you safe when the world ends. But the evidence suggests parts of that net were still being stitched together. You can physically see it in places like Vault 88, with unfinished wings, active construction areas, and that feeling of this was supposed to be bigger, but time ran out. And this isn't the only example of unfinished construction, even as far back as the second game in the series. You had examples of unfinished or under construction vaults, from the fake Vault 13 in Fallout 2, to Vault 114 in Fallout 4, to Vault 63 in Fallout 76. It only reinforces the point. If multiple vaults were incomplete, then the Vault program wasn't just morally broken, it was logistically unstable. And that leads to the following questions. Were people promised spots in vaults that couldn't take them? What did Vault-Tec do with unfinished vaults when the countdown hit 0? And ultimately, did unfinished vaults become experiments by accident or by design? Certainly scarier than the dog eating your homework, huh? Let's tackle the first question to start. If a vault wasn't finished, then a lot of people who paid for salvation may have been sold a seat on a lifeboat that didn't exist yet. Vault-Tec didn't sell maybe. They sold certainty, plans, assignments, a spot with you and your family's name on it. But if the door opens and the interior is still scaffolding and rubble, what happens to the families assigned there? They don't get a refund. They get a locked door, if a door is even built, and a sky full of fire. That means some of the Vault program's biggest casualties might have happened before the experiments ever started, just from unfinished infrastructure. Going ahead with the second question, the simplest answer is likely nothing, but let's think deeper about it. An unfinished vault forces an ugly decision, and Vault-Tec loves ugly decisions. If the vault isn't ready, you've got a few options, and all of them are bad. Option A, seal people inside anyway and figure it out later. This was exactly what happened to Vault 63, and it didn't quite turn out so well. Next option, Option B, use the vault as a temporary shelter. We see this happen with Vault 114, abandoned and later used by the local mobsters as an interrogation site. And finally, Option C, abandon it and pretend it was never part of the promise. And in a company built on secrecy and control, Option C is dangerously realistic. If Vault-Tec abandoned unfinished vaults, that's not a project delay. That's mass murder by bureaucracy. But if they didn't abandon them, then you get a new nightmare. Last question for this subject. Did unfinished vaults become experiments by accident? A half-built vault creates its own experiment even if Vault-Tec never designed one. Think about what being unfinished means underground. Bad seals, incomplete life support, unfinished medical bays, missing security systems, unmapped tunnels, no clean boundaries. That turns survival into a chaotic gamble between life and death, all because there wasn't enough time or effort put into finishing what should have been a safe shelter. Not because Vault-Tec planned it, but because Vault-Tec failed to finish the cage. And since we know for a fact that this has happened at least a few times, then some vault horrors aren't twisted science or science for science's sake. They're what happens when construction failure meets the apocalypse. And now, we hit the part that ties back to the data mystery in the creepiest way. The question behind the question, if a vault was unfinished, was it ever supposed to be counted? Unfinished vaults might explain why the vault list feels incomplete and inconsistent across the series. If some vaults never went live, Vault-Tec might have buried them in paperwork. No residents, no logs, no overseer reports, no public record. Just a number on a blueprint and a door that was never meant to open. Which means there could be ghost vaults we never see, not because they're unimportant, but because they were embarrassing or incriminating. The unfinished vault problem isn't just about construction, it's about missing history. Vaults that vanish from the story because they never became a story. And if that's true, then the next mystery is brutal, as it's not just the unfinished vaults that go on to have a legacy, it's the finished ones as well. But what happens when that legacy is slowly shifted or corrupted? Or is it simply Vault-Tec getting more success than what they ever could have hoped for? Vault mythology, mystery, history, hysteria. Now we hit the part that's way harder to explain with terminals and charts, because some vaults don't just fail. Some vaults become stories. Some of them have positive legacies, ones that went on to help the area or save the world. But others performed quite the opposite. They became the kind people whisper about like they're haunted houses. The kind traders detour around even if it costs them days. The kind even raiders won't raid because, nah man, that place is cursed. Which only begs the question, why do certain vaults stop being locations and start being myths? Because this isn't just simple wasteland superstition. In Fallout, myth is usually what's left when the truth is too horrifying to survive intact. Deathclaws started out as myths, as did the Enclave and Institute. It was only later on that people learned just how real and dangerous they were. Starting with the basics, a vault can outlive its facts. Most wastelanders don't learn vault history from terminals or books. They learn it from rumors, word of mouth from the town drunk or a local gossiper. Think about how knowledge travels in the wasteland. There's no internet, no textbooks, no stable government archives. Just caravans, bars, mercs, and old people telling stories with missing pieces. Maybe the radio will give a news story, but even then, no one's listening to a radio all day, every day. So when something terrifying happens in a vault, the exact details don't spread. The vibe does though. That's how a vault becomes a myth. The facts decay, but the fear doesn't. And the fear sticks to certain vaults for specific reasons. Patterns you can actually track. The first pattern is probably the most obvious. A vault that eats people. Vault myths often start with one simple outcome. People go in. You wait for an hour, a day, a week. After a month has passed, it becomes apparent that they won't come back. You don't need to understand FEV or social experiments to know what that means. If a scavenger vanishes, if a caravan crew never returns, if a raider band or gang goes inside and only one runs out screaming, you don't get a case study. You get a warning story. Because a vault becomes a myth the moment it develops a reputation for being a one-way door. And a lot of vaults in the Fallout world have that reputation for one reason or another, but it's the ones that don't earn that reputation that makes the situation all the worse. Because sometimes the vault isn't just dangerous, sometimes it's actively misleading. Some vaults don't look dirty, worn down, broken. Some are ones that, upon first inspection, look safe, clean, working machinery, coated in bright colors. That's the second pattern. It looks safe until you're already in too deep. Some vaults don't announce danger, they hide it. When it's not coated in 200 years of dirt and rust, the vault aesthetic is comforting by design. Clean corridors, bright lights, familiar signs. Even when it's rotting, it still looks like a form of safety at first glance. But anyone who has played a horror game or watched a scary movie knows what's up. That's why these vaults become the stuff of legend fast. They don't kill you, not immediately, not intentionally. They make you feel stupid for believing the myth of the vault in the first place. They're places where you can kick your feet up, take a sip of Nuka-Cola, and finally take a breath, free from the stress and horrors of the wasteland. And that's where it gets you. These are the vaults that create curses, because they punish curiosity. But myths don't form from traps or scares. Sometimes they form from something worse, something that changes the people who come back out. This is the third pattern you can tell the type of vault mythos by. Beyond the scares and comforts, it produces something else, something either long forgotten or something twisted and deformed. Survivors who don't sound human anymore. When a vault produces survivors who are wrong, it fuels myth faster than any corpse pile. A community can rationalize raiders. It can rationalize the dangers and products of radiation. But when somebody, or something, comes back, no longer recognizable, speaking gibberish, or they can't explain what happened without breaking down, or they start repeating the same phrase like it's a prayer, now you've got a story that spreads on its own. The vault becomes a myth factory, not because people know what happened, but because the survivors prove something happened that won't fit into normal words. And here's where this connects to the Vault-Tec data question in a nasty way. The less documentation a vault leaves behind, the more myth fills the gaps. Like it was said before, Wastelanders rely on word of mouth more than text or actual data. Except when a vault has no clear logs, no coherent history, no visible experiment notes, people don't conclude that there's no information available. We aren't machines, after all. They conclude basic concepts such as haunted, cursed, a monster, ghosts, demons, whatever fits their worldview. And Fallout encourages this by making some vaults feel like they're infected by a presence, not just a problem. Think back to places like Vault 1-8, Vault 11, Vault 51, so on and so forth. It occurs not just once per game, it's practically a staple for there to be multiple in each game. So myth isn't the opposite of data. Myth is what happens when data gets erased, taken, forgotten, which leads to the sharpest question in this entire section. Did Vault-Tec want some vaults to become myths? After all, a feared vault is a controlled vault, even centuries later. If a vault becomes taboo, people avoid it. They don't salvage it, repurpose it, or settle near it. They most especially don't open doors that might reveal the truth. After all, that place is haunted. You shouldn't be going near it, lest you die, get transformed, or have something else happen to not only you, but to the rest of the wasteland as well. Mythology becomes a security system that runs without electricity, and that raises the possibility that some vault failures weren't failures at all. They were designed to become legends, to protect something inside, or to bury what happened so deep nobody would ever dig it back up. So what exactly was Vault-Tec hoping to accomplish with all this? Getting into that may be perhaps the biggest vault mystery of all. Vault criteria. Success? Alright, last piece of the puzzle. Once you've asked why the all-clear never came, where the data went or how it was collected, how many vaults were simply unfinished, and why some vaults turned into myths, you eventually run into the question Vault-Tec never wanted anyone to ask. What did Vault-Tec actually call a successful vault? It certainly wasn't a vault that closed and opened back up without issue. Vault-Tec wanted problems. Vault-Tec needed problems. They engineered problems in one vault and gave the solution to another vault. If their success criteria wasn't the simple idea of people surviving and rebuilding, then everything else suddenly makes sense. This is where the whole vault program flips upside down. There's only one singular uncomfortable truth. Success wasn't survival. It was a statistic. Vault-Tec's success wasn't measured in lives saved. It was measured in outcomes produced. Look at the pattern across vault stories. So many vaults are built like they expect long-term stability, then have a single variable introduced that destroys stability on purpose. That isn't a shelter plan. That's a test. If survival was the goal, you remove variables. If data is the goal, you introduce them. And once you accept that, you can start guessing the real metrics. Metric number 1, compliance under pressure. Vault-Tec may have defined success as how controllable people are when isolated. A vault is the perfect controlled environment. Take vaults like Vault 101, with the ideal life so long as you never want to leave. Vault 8, a dystopia built on routine and identical identity. Vaults can only provide limited resources, limited exits, and a built-in authority figure. That's not just safety design, because the safety is only for the results Vault-Tec anticipated or wanted to begin with. That's behavior design, turning humans into mice, guinea pigs, or revealing the savage beast that lies beneath civilized nature. In that framework, a successful vault isn't peaceful, it's predictable. And that predictable behavior is incredibly valuable to someone who has made a business out of studying it. Metric 2, clean data, unhappy subjects. Vault 95, Vault 19, Vault 92. In each of these instances, and many more beyond those, Vault-Tec clearly cared more about usable data than the human cost. That explains why the all-clear never came for those types of vaults. You don't end the test early, you simply can't. You let it run until it produces a result, the desired result, or collapse. Collapse can be a result. If the experiment ends in disaster, that might still be successful if the data is recorded. Which brings us back to the creepiest part of the metric mystery. Who was this for? Put it in a frame of reference of what Vault-Tec clearly wanted for some of these vaults. Selecting winners for the next world. That's Vault-Tec's third metric, creating survivors and thriving groups to overcome the apocalypse and the wasteland. In certain instances, Vault-Tec had been using vaults to identify which kinds of societies are easiest to rebuild and also the easiest to rule. Vault 11, Vault 75, Vault 51. Some vaults clearly feel like they were meant to create specific outputs, stable communities, specialized personnel, hardened survivors, all part of one obedient structure. In that model, vaults aren't just protection for experiments or homes, they're filters. And that ties directly into the unfinished vault problem, because for Vault-Tec, even failure can be a feature as the fourth metric of success. An unfinished vault isn't necessarily a mistake in this mindset. It's an extreme stress test. If you're measuring what breaks people or what forces adaptation, an unfinished vault produces chaos fast, while also not being liable to random factors that could accelerate or slow down the process. Think of it like doing a school or work project the night before it's due. Sure, it might not get you a perfect score, but it produces data fast. That means some vault nightmares might not be a plan that failed. They might be accelerated planning. And if and when those results leak onto the surface, you get the next outcome, the mythos. You get myths as a form of containment. That's the fifth and ultimate way Vault-Tec ensured that long after the war, their experiments, their test subjects, their data would remain secure, contained, and protected. After all, a vault that becomes a legend is a vault that stays undisturbed. If people fear a vault, they don't move in. Just look at what happened to Vault 19 and Vault 94. They don't salvage it. They don't pull apart its systems. They don't expose what happened. And that means the idea of a vault becoming a myth might be the most elegant security system Vault-Tec ever devised, intentionally or not. So when you connect all of this, everything that's been covered, explored, and explained, get ready for a grim answer. Here's the thread that ties the whole mystery board together. For some vaults, the all-clear never came because it was never the point. It was a way of getting vaults to accept their conditioning, the promise that one day, Vault-Tec and the civilized world would make their grand return, and they could set out and reclaim humanity and America's rightful place in the world. For other vaults, the data didn't disappear. It was never meant for us to find in the first place. It had already been taken away, transmitted, teleported to a location that maybe a future episode of the TV show or a future game may one day reveal. Or maybe it was never real to begin with. Another illusion by Vault-Tec. Perhaps the unfinished vaults weren't embarrassing accidents caused by incompetence, poor planning, contentment with the status quo. Maybe they were just experiments that started early, if only because the world ending puts a rather large delay on the idea of finishing on schedule. And maybe the vaults that became myths didn't become myths by chance. Maybe that was the final layer of one of the deepest and biggest mysteries that Vault-Tec, that the Fallout franchise, continues to linger and tease us with to this day. Because if Vault-Tec's success criteria wasn't simply to save humanity, but measure humanity, and measure it in all of the ways that were just discussed, then the Vault program doesn't look like a tragedy. It looks like a machine that worked exactly as designed. And the scariest part, we're still walking through the results. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you want to see what happened to every Vault experiment in Fallout, click the video on the screen. These are the 7 levels of Fallout vaults. Level 1, trash vaults. These are the boring ones, the ones that actually worked like advertised. Out of 122 vaults built across America, only 17 were straight up normal shelters where people could ride out the apocalypse without Vault-Tec pulling some twisted experiment. Places like Vault 8 and Vault 76 76 fall into this category. They got their GX terraforming kits, their water chips didn't mysteriously fail, nobody was secretly dosing the air supply with hallucinogens, and they weren't filled with a man named Gary. Vault 8 in Nevada is the poster child here. It only opened 4 years later than it was supposed to. The dwellers used their Garden of Eden creation kit to terraform the wasteland, and boom, they founded Vault City by 2091. The place became this weirdly functional post-apocalyptic settlement with actual infrastructure and governance. Vault 76 in West Virginia is another control vault, the one you start in during Fallout 76. It was designed to open exactly 25 years after the bombs dropped on Reclamation Day, and it actually did. No weird twists or surprise cannibalism, just a bunch of people walking out into the wasteland to rebuild America like the brochures promised. These vaults matter because they prove Vault-Tec could have saved people if they wanted to. They had the technology and resources to build genuine Fallout shelters, but instead they chose to run sick experiments on 105 of the 122 vaults they constructed. But here's the thing, if Vault-Tec could build 17 working vaults, why make 105 death traps? Keep that question in mind, because the answer isn't what you think. Now let's see what happened when they started testing isolation. Level 2, Isolation Vaults. This level is where Vault-Tec started testing how humans handle being completely cut off from everything. Vault 101 from Fallout 3 is the most famous example. The tagline was literally Vault 101, Jewel of the Wastes, but the real experiment was that nobody was ever supposed to leave, ever. The Overseer had standing orders to keep that vault sealed indefinitely, and anyone who even talked about opening the door was labeled a dissident. Your character's dad breaking this rule by escaping to find a water purifier is what kicks off the entire main quest of Fallout 3. Vault 13 from the original Fallout also falls here, though with a different spin. It was designed to stay sealed for 200 years to study prolonged isolation, but their water chip conveniently failed after just a few decades, forcing them to send someone out into the wasteland. That someone becomes the Vault Dweller, the protagonist of the first game, who has to trek across California looking for replacement parts. The whole water chip failure might have been intentional sabotage by Vault-Tec to see what happens when isolated communities face extinction-level equipment failures. Vault 21 in New Vegas took isolation in a weird direction by making everything inside decided by gambling. Every dispute, every decision, every allocation of resources came down to games of chance. It worked surprisingly well until Mr. House showed up and won the vault in a game of blackjack, then filled most of it with concrete. The isolation experiments reveal Vault-Tec's obsession with control and obedience. They wanted to know if they could create perfectly insulated societies that would follow orders without question. Communities so indoctrinated they'd never challenge authority even when it meant their own doom. These vaults often developed cult-like social structures where the Overseer was basically a dictator and questioning the system was heresy. The psychological damage from these experiments lasted generations, creating societies that couldn't adapt when they finally did open and face the real wasteland. But isolation was just psychology. What comes next is where Vault-Tec started weaponizing human needs themselves, and one vault proves they'd even weaponize people's recovery just to watch them destroy each other. Level 3, Survival Experiments. Now Vault-Tec wanted to see what happens when you give people just barely enough, or way too much of something specific. Vault 34 is the perfect example of too much. This vault near Vegas was stuffed with an absolutely insane amount of weapons and ammunition, way more than any civilian shelter would ever need. The experiment was basically what happens when everyone has unlimited access to guns in a confined space. Spoiler alert, they formed armed factions, fought over the reactor, and when it leaked radiation, most of them died. The survivors became the Boomers, that artillery-obsessed faction at Nellis Air Force Base who shoot at literally anyone who gets close. Vault 22 tested resource scarcity from a different angle, focusing on food production. They were experimenting with mutated plant spores to create fast-growing crops, which sounds genius until you learn the spores turned people into hostile plant zombie things. The scientists kept pushing their experiments even as dwellers started transforming, and eventually the whole vault became overrun with these spore carriers. You explore this nightmare in New Vegas, fighting through fungus-infected tunnels and mutated plants while reading terminal entries about how the scientists knew exactly what was happening and kept going anyway. Vault 95 weaponized addiction and recovery. It was advertised as a rehabilitation facility for chem addicts, a clean space where people could get sober and stay sober. For 5 years it actually worked. People kicked their habits and built a supportive community. Then, as planned, Vault-Tec had a plan to open a secret stash of chems in the walls. The resulting relapse destroyed everything. Dwellers turned on each other, and the vault fell apart. When you find it in Fallout 4, it's occupied by gunners who are using it as a base, completely unaware of the deliberately engineered tragedy that happened there. These experiments were Vault-Tec's way of studying human behavior under extreme conditions, specifically how societies function when basic needs become weapons. The data they collected was supposedly for planning long-term space colonization, figuring out minimum resource requirements for generation ships or Mars colonies, but really it was just corporate-funded sadism dressed up as science, watching people suffer for spreadsheets and graphs, or so it seemed, because every experiment was teaching Vault-Tec something specific about human breaking points. The question is, why did they need to know? Level 4. Social experiment. This is where Vault-Tec crossed a different line. They weren't just studying how people break. They were discovering how to make people build entire societies around their own destruction. Vault 11 proves it, and what the computer told the last 5 survivors reveals exactly what Vault-Tec learned about human nature. Vault 11 is hands down one of the darkest experiments in the entire franchise. The Vault's computer told residents they had to sacrifice one person every year, or everyone would die. They developed this whole electoral system where they'd vote for an overseer, who would then be executed. Candidates used propaganda, bribery, and blackmail to avoid winning. Voting blocks formed, people manipulated elections, and this went on for years until one election cycle failed and only 5 people remained. They refused to sacrifice anyone, and when they finally told the computer no, it revealed the whole thing was a test and they'd actually passed by refusing. But by then, 4 of them killed each other in the aftermath, and only one survived, completely broken. That's the discovery Vault-Tec was after. Give humans the right rules, and they'll create systems that destroy them without question. They'll accept authority even when it's killing them. This data was worth everything to someone. But who? Vault 118 up in Far Harbor ran a class experiment. They divided the vault into sectors for rich elites and poor workers, but the workers section was never completed, so it ended up being just 10 ultra-wealthy people isolated together, and they eventually transferred their consciousnesses into robot bodies to achieve immortality. When you arrive, they're still there as these brainbots, completely unaware that centuries have passed and they're essentially digital ghosts acting out their pre-war aristocratic fantasies. Vault 19 in the Mojave tested paranoia by deliberately dividing dwellers into 2 groups, red and blue, and giving them separate sections of the vault. The computer systems were rigged to make each side think the other was sabotaging them. Subliminal messages, fake alerts, manipulated supply counts, all designed to manufacture conflict where none existed. Eventually, both groups abandoned the vault rather than fight, which is almost a happy ending by Vault-Tec standards. Vault 112 might be the cruelest. Dr. Braun, the overseer, trapped everyone in virtual reality pods running a simulation he controlled. For over 200 years, he's been psychologically torturing them, forcing them to live through scenario after scenario where he plays God. They can't die, can't escape, just endless cycles of whatever twisted narrative Braun feels like inflicting. Your interaction with this vault in Fallout 3 involves entering the simulation, and either helping the residents escape or helping Braun torture them more. Because even the player isn't safe from these moral nightmares. The social experiments prove Vault-Tec understood human psychology well enough to break it systematically. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully designed scenarios testing specific hypotheses about authority, conformity, and social collapse. The Enclave wanted this data for colonization projects, figuring out exactly how much stress a closed society could handle before fracturing. Level 5. Evolution experiments. Everything up to now was psychology and social control, but these next vaults reveal something darker. Vault-Tec wasn't trying to save humanity. They were trying to replace it, and in Vault 87, they actually succeeded. Vault 87 sits at the top of this category. This vault in the Capital Wasteland wasn't a shelter at all. It was a research facility testing the forced evolutionary virus. They were supposed to study FEV effects on human subjects, but study quickly became mass mutation experiment. Nearly every dweller was transformed into super mutants, those giant green monsters that populate the Capital Wasteland. The vault became ground zero for the East Coast super mutant population, and you can find it in Fallout 3, still crawling with mutants and radiation so intense that approaching from certain directions will kill you instantly. One of the few survivors who kept his mind is Fox, the super mutant companion you can recruit who was intelligent enough to realize what happened and hates Vault-Tec for it. Vault 92 ran audio-based mind control experiments. They filled this vault with musicians, supposedly to preserve performing arts through the apocalypse. But the real plan involved subliminal messaging hidden in white noise played constantly through the vault's speaker system. The messages were supposed supposed to create super soldiers by conditioning extreme aggression and obedience to commands. Instead, everyone went violently insane, killing each other in brutal rampages. When you explore it in Fallout 3, you find terminal entries from a violinist who slowly realizes the music is changing him, making him angry and violent, but he can't stop it or escape. Vault 96 in Fallout 76 was sold as an animal preservation project, basically Noah's Ark for wasteland creatures. What residents didn't know was that Vault-Tec was using them to test aggressive mutation serums on the animals. They had quotas for genetic modifications, pushing mutations harder and faster to see what would happen. Predictably, the creatures became unstable and dangerous, and after the dwellers died to the Vault's mainframe activating a superseding security protocol during their failed escape attempt, the mutated creatures escaped. The specimens went into Appalachia, which explains some of the more horrifying mutated wildlife you encounter. Vault 75. Beneath a middle school ran a eugenics program focused on children. Kids were separated from parents on entry, told their families died, and raised in an underground facility that constantly tested them through brutal competition. The weakest were reclaimed, which Vault-Tec speaks of being murdered and harvested for genetic material. The strongest were bred to create perfect specimens. The scientists pushed this for generations until the teenagers eventually figured it out and revolted, killing all the researchers. You can explore this vault in Fallout 4 and read the heartbreaking terminal entries from both the kids and the scientists who rationalized atrocity as progress. Each experiment maps perfectly to a specific problem, but what problem were they solving? That's next. These biological experiments represent Vault-Tec at its most callous, treating human life as raw material for science. The goal was ostensibly to understand genetic manipulation and create enhanced humans for space colonization, but the methods were straight out of the worst moments in human history. Eugenics programs and unethical medical experimentation cranked up to apocalyptic extremes. Level 6. Experimental vaults. These vaults tested one final variable: minimum viable systems. How little technology do you need to keep humans alive in a closed environment? Because if you're noticing that every experiment sounds like preparation for something, you're right, and what comes after this explains everything. Vault 88, which you can explore and build in Fallout 4's DLC, was designed to test prototype Vault-Tec technologies on unwitting subjects. The Overseer, who survived as a ghoul, was working on devices like exercise bikes that drained life force, soda machines that dispensed chems, and slot machines rigged for behavior modification. The Vault was never finished before the bombs dropped, so the experiments never ran at full scale. But you can choose to complete them yourself or sabotage the Overseer's plans and make the technology actually helpful. Vault 114 took a different approach, experimenting with leadership structures through architecture. This vault beneath a subway station in Boston was deliberately designed to be uncomfortable. The Overseer's room was a transparent office in the middle of everything with zero privacy, and the whole vault was built to create constant tension between authority figures and residents. The idea was to test if leaders could maintain control when they had no special privileges or private space. Construction never finished before the war, so the experiment never ran, but the criminal Skinny Malone moved in and made it his headquarters in Fallout 4. Vault 108 had a cloning lab because Vault-Tec wanted to know what happens when you can mass-produce humans. The Overseer was terminally ill, and the plan was to clone one resident named Gary over and over to study hive mind dynamics and identity degradation. Instead, the Garys gained sentience as a collective, realized they were being used, and turned on everyone else. By the time you reach this vault in Fallout 3, it's entirely populated by hostile Gary clones who can only say their own name, creating this deeply unsettling atmosphere where every enemy is the same person copied hundreds of times. Vault 106 tested chemical warfare technology through psychoactive drugs pumped into the ventilation system. The gas was supposed to induce hallucinations and paranoia, which it absolutely did. 10 days after the vault sealed, dwellers started experiencing vivid hallucinations and violent delusions. The vault descended into chaos as people attacked hallucinations that looked like their friends and family. Centuries later, when you explore it, the gas is still active, causing the lone wanderer to hallucinate during exploration, seeing fake enemies, and distorted versions of reality. The technology experiments show Vault-Tec's complete disregard for safety protocols or ethics. They were testing prototype devices that should have gone through decades of trials, instead throwing them into live environments with real people. The Enclave wanted data on cutting-edge tech for their projects, and Vault-Tec was happy to provide it regardless of cost. These vaults often left behind functioning but dangerous technology that wastelanders stumbled into, creating new threats centuries after the original experiments ended. Level 7. Legendary Vaults. Here's what every single experiment was actually for. Vault-Tec and the Enclave weren't preparing to survive nuclear war, they were preparing to leave Earth entirely. According to Fallout's co-creator Tim Kaine, Vault-Tec and the Enclave designed these experiments to gather data for an interstellar colonization project. They believed Earth might become completely uninhabitable and wanted to understand how humans would survive on generation ships traveling to other planets. Every experiment tested a different variable relevant to space travel. Isolation mirrors deep space missions, resource scarcity reflects limited ship supplies, social engineering explores governance and closed systems, biological experiments prepare for alien environments, and technology tests determine minimum viable systems. The Enclave, remnants of the US government, monitored all the vaults from remote locations, collecting data transmitted from each overseer. They planned to USC this research to select the strongest survivors for their ARC project if Earth truly became unlivable. The vaults were essentially massive lab rats, with 105 out of 122 facilities running some kind of experiment while the 17 control vaults provided baseline data. The vaults were never shelters. They were simulations of generation ships, and every person who walked into one thinking they'd be saved became a test subject for humanity's escape plan. But here's where it gets even darker. Vault-Tec sold this to the government by framing it as necessary preparation for humanity's survival, the ultimate contingency plan that required extreme measures. The Fallout TV series that dropped in 2024 adds another layer to this. It reveals Vault-Tec executives meeting before the war, discussing their experiments and plans. Vaults 31 through 33 form a connected system where Vault 31 holds cryogenically frozen Vault-Tec management who periodically wake up to oversee and manipulate the other two vaults, essentially creating a perpetual corporation that outlives the apocalypse. The show hints that Vault-Tec might have had a hand in starting the Great War itself, ensuring their vaults would be needed and their experiments could proceed. While that's not confirmed in game canon, it fits the pattern of corporate evil that defines Vault-Tec's legacy. What makes this endgame truly disturbing is the scale of the lie. Vault-Tec spent billions of dollars, involved thousands of employees, and built 122 facilities, all while maintaining the facade of salvation. The advertising, the Vault Boy mascot giving thumbs up, the cheerful instructional videos about surviving atomic war, it was all marketing for the largest unethical human experiment in history. Families bought into this promise of safety, paid for vault spots, and walked into their assigned shelters thinking they'd secured their future. Instead, they became test subjects in scenarios designed to break them. The data collected from these experiments supposedly justified the suffering, providing insights into human psychology and society under extreme stress. But even if the Enclave used this information for space colonization, it doesn't change what happened to the people trapped in vaults, living their entire lives as unwitting participants in someone else's grand design. Vault survivors who emerged into the wasteland, either because their vault failed or succeeded, spread across America and influenced the formation of major factions. The new California Republic traces its roots to vault dwellers. The Brotherhood of Steel interacted with vault technology constantly, and super mutants from vault experiments shaped entire regions. The Vault-Tec Corporation itself was deeply embedded in pre-war America, with university campuses, demonstration vaults, and promotional centers spreading their brand. Vault-Tec University in Fallout 76 was a training facility for vault personnel, but even there, Vault-Tec ran experiments, starving the students to test emergency rationing protocols. The demonstration vault in Los Angeles, which appears in Fallout 1, was meant to show off vault technology to potential customers, but later became the master's base of operations, proving that even Vault-Tec's public relations efforts came back to haunt the wasteland. Vault-Tec didn't fail, they succeeded. Every experiment proved what they wanted to know: humans adapt. We suffer, obey, rebuild, and survive. Even after centuries of cruelty, their systems still echo through the wasteland. If you enjoyed this video and want to see every deleted vault experiment, click the video on the screen. Vault 111. This is where most modern fans first discovered that Vault-Tec was lying to everyone, and it's the perfect introduction to just how deep this conspiracy goes. You play as the sole survivor who enters what you think is a temporary decontamination shelter, only to be frozen in cryogenic pods for 200 years while watching your spouse get murdered and your son kidnapped. The Vault was advertised as a short-term safety measure, but was actually a long-term experiment in cryogenic preservation, using unwitting test subjects. Vault 111 serves as most players' first real understanding that every vault door hides a different horror, and the people promising to save you are often the ones planning to experiment on you. But this cryogenic betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg compared to the systematic psychological torture happening elsewhere. Vault 101. This vault established the no one enters, no one leaves rule under complete dictatorial overseer control, creating a permanent prison disguised as a safety shelter. The vault number itself references George Orwell's 1984, Room 101, where people are sent for re-education, showing that Vault-Tec's designers were well aware they were creating totalitarian nightmares. Residents lived under absolute authoritarian control for generations, with the overseer maintaining power through isolation and information control. The Vault demonstrates how easily protection can become imprisonment when those in charge have unlimited authority and no oversight. If you thought permanent dictatorship was bad, the next revelation shows the true scope of Vault-Tec's deception. Vault-Tec Corporation. The Fallout TV show finally confirmed what fans suspected for decades. Vault-Tec didn't just profit from nuclear war, they actively orchestrated it. Corporate executives are shown plotting to drop the first nuclear bombs themselves to ensure their Vault experiments could proceed and guarantee their post-war dominance. This transforms every single Vault experiment, from cruel science into part of a master plan for corporate control of post-apocalyptic America. Vault-Tec had billions invested in underground facilities and human experimentation that could only be justified if civilization actually collapsed, making nuclear holocaust a business necessity. But even knowing Vault-Tec started the war, the real horror is how few people they actually intended to save. Control vaults. Out of 122 vaults constructed across America, only 17 were legitimate shelters designed to function as advertised, meaning 88% of Vault-Tec's safety shelters were actually torture chambers. This reveals the staggering scope of deception where nearly every family that thought they were being saved was actually being fed to human experimentation programs. The control vaults served as baseline data for comparison against the experimental horrors, but they also provided Vault-Tec with a small population of normal humans for whatever post-war plans they had in mind. The numbers prove that Vault-Tec viewed the American population as expendable test subjects, rather than people worthy of rescue. While these surface revelations are disturbing, they're nothing compared to the specific horrors conducted in individual vaults. Vault 87. This vault conducted systematic FEV testing by locking residents in chambers and exposing them to forced evolutionary virus, while scientists observed their mutations from behind safety glass. Within 2 weeks, most subjects died in agony from the transformation process, while survivors became the super mutants that would terrorize the capital wasteland for centuries. The experiment continued for years, with scientists documenting every stage of human transformation into hulking, often mentally impaired creatures. Vault 87 represents the ultimate violation of medical ethics, turning an entire community into unwilling test subjects for biological weapons research. But if you thought biological experimentation was the worst thing humans could do to each other, the next vault weaponized democracy itself. Vault 11. This experiment represents perhaps the most psychologically devastating manipulation in the entire Vault network. Residents were told they must democratically vote to sacrifice one person annually, or everyone in the Vault would be killed by the computer systems. For years, they held elections that were essentially murder campaigns, where people tried to nominate their enemies for death while the community tore itself apart through betrayal and political manipulation. The ultimate horror came when the final 5 survivors refused to continue the sacrifices, only to learn the computer was lying and actually congratulated them for making the right choice by not killing anybody. The Vault proved that even democracy can be perverted into a tool for systematic murder when authority figures control the information. While democratic murder was psychologically devastating, the next Vault trapped people in an even more personal hell. Vault 112. Dr. Stanislaus Braun trapped 85 residents in virtual reality pods for over 200 years, forcing them to endure psychological torture in his Tranquility Lane simulation for his personal amusement. The residents experienced repeated death and trauma within the simulation while being unable to truly die, creating perfect conditions for infinite psychological torture. Braun treated human consciousness like his personal video game, resetting scenarios whenever he got bored and subjecting people to whatever sadistic fantasies he could imagine. The Vault represents the ultimate fusion of technology and cruelty, where a single sociopathic scientist could torment dozens of people for centuries without consequence. If you thought virtual reality torture was sophisticated evil, the next Vault took a more direct biological approach. Vault 22. The agricultural experiment with plant spores went horrifically wrong when the enhanced vegetation turned residents into undead plant-human hybrid creatures called spore crawlers. The Vault's research into hardy, radiation-resistant crops created something far more sinister when the plants began using human hosts for reproduction and survival. Survivors became shambling horrors that were part human, part plant, and completely hostile to any remaining uninfected humans. The Vault shows how even beneficial research, like improving food production, can become a biological nightmare when conducted without proper safety protocols. But these well-documented horrors are just the surface level of what Vault-Tec was willing to do to people. Vault 27. This overcrowding experiment deliberately housed 2 zero people in space designed for 1 0, studying the psychological and social effects of extreme overcrowding in a sealed environment. The vault was designed to create constant resource shortages, interpersonal conflicts, and claustrophobic conditions that would drive residents to violence and desperation. The experiment exists primarily in reference materials, but it represents one of Vault-Tec's most straightforward approaches to human suffering through simple mathematical cruelty. By doubling the population and keeping resources constant, they guaranteed that every day would be a struggle for survival even without external threats. While overcrowding was simple, mathematical cruelty, the next experiments used gender as a weapon. Vault 68 and Vault 69. These twin experiments in sexual dynamics placed 999 men with one woman in Vault 68 and 999 women with one man in Vault 69. The vaults were designed to study how extreme gender imbalances would create social chaos, sexual competition, and psychological trauma for everyone involved. The lone individual of each gender faced impossible pressure and exploitation, while the majority competed desperately for attention, resources, and reproductive rights. These experiments show how Vault-Tec was willing to use basic human biology and social dynamics as tools for systematic psychological torture. But if you thought gender manipulation was disturbing, the next vault created an army of mentally damaged clones. Vault 108. The cloning experiment created 54 copies of original resident Gary, while deliberately designing leadership conflicts through terminal cancer for the overseer and failing power systems. The Gary clones were mentally stunted and programmed with limited vocabulary, eventually going insane and escaping their chambers to cannibalize the entire vault staff. The vault became filled with dozens of deranged clones wandering the halls, endlessly repeating Gary, while surrounded by the bones of the scientists who created them. The experiment represents Vault-Tec's willingness to play God with human reproduction, while demonstrating complete disregard for the psychological welfare of their artificial humans. While cloning created physical horror, the next vault weaponized art itself. Vault 92. This experiment housed musicians who were exposed to white noise and hypnotic frequencies designed to make them violent through subliminal psychological manipulation. The vault tested whether creativity and artistic expression could be controlled and weaponized through sound-based brainwashing techniques. The audio manipulation eventually drove residents to madness and violence, turning artists into killers while proving that even humanity's most beautiful expressions could be perverted into tools of control. The experiment shows how Vault-Tec viewed every aspect of human culture as potential ammunition for their psychological warfare research. But if you thought weaponizing music was twisted, the next vault used paranoia as a surgical instrument. Vault 19. This paranoia induction experiment divided residents into red and blue sectors with separate overseers, using subliminal messaging, flickering lights, strange drafts, falsified medical records, and limited water supplies to create artificial distrust. Red residents believed blues were poisoning them, while blues thought reds were sabotaging resources, creating escalating conflicts that tore the community apart. The experiment was technically a failure because the vault's location above sulfur deposits created real paranoia symptoms like headaches and nausea, making it a chemical rather than non-chemical means of inducing paranoia. The vault demonstrates how easily people can be manipulated into hating each other over completely fabricated differences when authority figures control the information flow. These documented experiments represent just the vaults that made it into the final games, but the cut content reveals even darker possibilities. Vault 120. Todd Howard confirmed this cut Fallout 4 content would have featured a BioShock-style underwater vault with a massive, sentient octopus living outside the facility. The underwater vault would have combined claustrophobia, isolation, and the constant threat of a giant intelligent predator that could potentially breach the facility at any time. This cut content shows how much darker and more ambitious Fallout 4's vault experiments originally were before being scaled back for the final release. The concept demonstrates that Vault-Tec's imagination for human suffering extended even to the ocean floor. While underwater horror was cut from the final game, other cancelled vaults explored different forms of family destruction. Vault 29. From the cancelled Van Buren Fallout 3, this vault only admitted children under 15 years old, permanently separating them from their parents, who were sent to different facilities. The experiment was designed to study child development without adult guidance, while using the trauma of family separation as a psychological variable. Children would have been raised by AI systems while never knowing what happened to their parents or siblings, creating a generation of psychologically damaged individuals. This family separation experiment represents pure cruelty, disguised as developmental psychology research. If you thought separating families was evil, the next vault added wild animals to make survival even more impossible. Vault 43. This survival horror scenario locked 20 men, 10 women, and one panther together to study how desperate humans would react to a deadly predator in their living space. The experiment exists only in reference materials, but represents Vault-Tec's willingness to use apex predators as experimental variables in human behavior studies. Residents would have faced the constant threat of being killed and eaten while trying to maintain some form of civilization in an impossibly dangerous environment. The Vault shows how Vault-Tec viewed both humans and animals as disposable components in their twisted scientific experiments. But the released games contained even more sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation. Vault 75. Hidden beneath Malden Middle School, this eugenics experiment only admitted children under 15 while immediately executing all adults upon entry. Children underwent rigorous physical training and combat drills while being told they were preparing for UPTOPLAND, but at age 18 they were sorted into 3 categories. Genetically superior children had their genetic material harvested, then were killed. Intellectually superior but physically weak children were recruited as scientists, and inferior children were executed immediately. A child named Rohit discovered classified papers and organized a successful uprising with James and Alma, aided by Washington, a former resident turned scientist who had grown attached to the younger children. When players arrive, only gunner mercenaries and skeletons in Vault-Tec uniforms remain as evidence of this systematic child harvesting operation. While child harvesting was openly murderous, the next Vault used false hope as a weapon. Vault 81. This vault was designed to test experimental pathogens on residents using mole rats as carriers, but Overseer Olivet discovered the secret lab and locked the scientists inside, allowing residents to live normally for over 200 years. When the sole survivor arrives, a child named Austin accidentally enters the hidden lab and contracts mole rat disease, which causes permanent health damage and can only be cured with a single Vault 81 cure found in the lab. This creates one of Fallout 4's most difficult moral choices, where players must decide whether to save themselves or save the child, showing how even subverted Vault experiments continue to create ethical dilemmas centuries later. If you thought moral dilemmas were cruel, the next Vault deliberately destroyed people who had overcome their worst problems. Vault 95. Located in the glowing sea, this vault housed 72 former chem addicts who were successfully rehabilitated over 5 years with no access to drugs. After 5 years of sobriety and recovery, a hidden stash of psycho and other chems was automatically unlocked, and the vault descended into chaos as residents murdered each other for drugs. The experiment proved that psychological addiction persists even after physical recovery, making recovery meaningless when temptation returns. By 2287, the vault is overrun by gunners, and Kate's companion quest involves using the Vault's clean room technology to cure her addiction, though this only addresses physical dependence. But Vault-Tec's cruelty extended beyond just psychological manipulation to deliberate radiation exposure. Vault 12. Built beneath Bakersfield with a vault door designed not to close properly, this experiment deliberately exposed residents to radiation to study long-term effects on human physiology. Most residents became ghouls, and eventually founded Necropolis under the leadership of Set, who drove out the original human overseer. In Fallout 1, players must retrieve the water chip from this vault, but doing so cuts off Necropolis's water supply, forcing players to choose between saving their own vault or